There is a stretch of coastline on this planet that has been continuously occupied by human beings for longer than any other known coastline on Earth. Not the Mediterranean, not the coast of China, not the Atlantic seaboard of Europe or Africa. Australia. The people who live along Australia's shores today are the direct cultural descendants of men and women who arrived there somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, and possibly earlier than that. They navigated open ocean to get there. They crossed stretches of water that no other species of human being had ever crossed before. They arrived during the last ice age, when sea levels were dramatically lower, when the landscape they walked onto looked almost nothing like what exists today. And then they stayed. For tens of thousands of years, they watched the ocean rise. They watched it swallow coastlines. They watched rivers become estuaries and plains become seabeds. They built knowledge systems to track and remember all of it. And some of that knowledge, preserved in oral traditions that are now among the oldest continuously maintained bodies of knowledge on the planet, describes things that modern geology only confirmed in the last 100 years. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. That alone should give you pause. But it is only the beginning of what Australia's coastline holds. Because when you start digging, and researchers have been digging in earnest only very recently, what comes back up is not the simple story of isolated hunter-gatherers living quietly on a continent nobody else knew about. What comes back up is a record of sophisticated maritime activity, evidence of structures that the official archaeological record has not yet categorized, oral traditions that describe catastrophic geographic events in precise enough detail to be cross-referenced with deep-time geology, and a systematic pattern of incomplete investigation that leaves more questions open than it closes. The coast of Australia is, in the truest sense of the phrase, one of the last frontiers of human prehistory. And the longer researchers look at it, the stranger it gets. The starting point for understanding any of this is sea level. Right now, if you stand on the Australian coast and look out at the water, you are looking at a landscape that was very different 20,000 years ago. During the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, sea levels globally were somewhere between 100 and 130 meters lower than they are today. For Australia, that difference was enormous. The continental shelf extends outward from the current coastline for significant distances in every direction, and during the glacial maximum, all of that shelf was dry land. The modern coastline of Australia is not the coastline that the earliest Australians knew. The coast they lived on, the coast where they built their economies, their spiritual systems, their knowledge of the sea, is now underwater. It has been underwater for thousands of years. The scale of what was lost is hard to grasp. The Sahul Shelf to the northwest, the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, the Bass Strait between mainland Australia and Tasmania, the Timor Sea, the area that connected Australia to New Guinea, all of this was, at various points in the human occupation of Australia, dry land that people walked across, camped on, fished from, and built lives on. The Bass Strait alone, when dry, would have been a landmass larger than Great Britain. The Gulf of Carpentaria, when the sea level was low enough, was an inland lake of enormous size. The Arafura region was a broad coastal plain that connected Australia and New Guinea into a single landmass that researchers call Sahul. All of that is gone now, drowned under rising oceans that began climbing roughly 18,000 years ago and did not stabilize at roughly modern levels until somewhere around 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago. That is within the time frame of recorded human history in other parts of the world. The earliest Sumerian writing dates to roughly that period. The earliest Egyptian dynastic records are younger. While the first cities of Mesopotamia were being built, the Australian coast was still actively changing, still flooding, still pushing people back from shores they had known for generations. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians, maintained with extraordinary precision across uncountable generations, hold memories of that flooding. And when researchers began to examine those traditions scientifically, what they found was not myth, it was geology. In 2020, a research paper published in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews undertook a systematic examination of Aboriginal oral traditions describing sea level changes. The research team, led by Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reid, identified 21 distinct stories from coastal Aboriginal communities across Australia that described landscapes, waterways, and geographical features that no longer exist above sea level. These were not vague references to water or floods in a general sense. These were specific, detailed accounts of specific places, specific bays, specific islands, specific features of the coastal landscape that had been swallowed by the rising sea. And when the researchers cross-referenced those oral accounts with the known geology of sea level change in those specific regions, the accounts were accurate. The timelines matched. The specific features being described corresponded to geological realities that had been submerged for between 7,000 and 12,000 years. Think carefully about what that means. It means that somewhere in the corpus of Aboriginal oral tradition, human beings have been maintaining accurate, verifiable memory of geographical events that happened more than 7,000 years ago. In some cases, more than 10,000 years ago. The stories were passed down not in writing, not in stone tablets, not in any material form that we typically associate with the preservation of precise information, but in oral tradition, in ceremony, in song, in story, and they held. They held through 10,000 years of transmission without corrupting into fiction. Researchers in the field of cognitive science and oral tradition scholarship are still working out how that was possible. The leading hypothesis involves the embedding of geographic and historical information within multi-layered ceremonial structures, cross-checked by multiple community members and retold in contexts where accuracy was socially enforced in ways that modern oral communication is not. The mechanisms are not fully understood, but the accuracy of the result is documented. This alone tells you something important about the people who lived on Australia's coast before recorded history, before the arrival of Europeans, before any of the frameworks we typically use to discuss civilization and knowledge. They were not simply surviving. They were maintaining sophisticated systems of knowledge transfer across timescales that no other documented human knowledge system has achieved. And they were doing it about a coast that was actively, catastrophically changing around them. The flooding was not a slow and imperceptible rise. In certain periods, sea level rise could be relatively rapid on a geological scale, fast enough that a human community living on the coast during a bad decade could watch familiar fishing grounds disappear underwater within a single lifetime. In the Gulf of Carpentaria region, research suggests that when the sea breached the barriers holding back the expanding ocean, the flooding of the ancient lake basin could have proceeded with dramatic speed, pushing large coastal populations inland in a matter of decades or generations. In the Torres Strait region, the separation of Australia from New Guinea as a land connection and the creation of the strait itself occurred within the human occupation period. People were alive on both sides when the water came through. The oral traditions of communities in the Torres Strait and the Cape York Peninsula region contain accounts that may preserve memory of that separation. They describe a time when people could walk between what are now islands, when the land was continuous, when the relationships between communities on either side were maintained by overland travel. These traditions have not been subject to the same rigorous cross-referencing that Nunn and Reid applied to the sea level studies in southern Australia, and the scientific work there is genuinely incomplete. But the pattern is consistent. Wherever researchers have looked closely at the geographical content of coastal Aboriginal traditions and compared them to the geological record, the traditions have held up. The implications for what we do not yet know are staggering. If accurate memory of coastal geography has been preserved for 7,000 to 12,000 years in the traditions that researchers have examined so far, what about the traditions that have not yet been examined with that level of rigor? What about the communities whose traditions were disrupted or destroyed entirely by the colonial period, taking irreplaceable geographical information with them? What about the traditions that are held by communities who have not yet chosen to share them with outside researchers? For reasons that are entirely legitimate, given the history of how Aboriginal knowledge has been treated by non-Indigenous scholars? And what about the coast itself? If people were living on that coast for 50,000 years before the flooding, the archaeological evidence for those 50,000 years is now underwater. The tools they made, the hearths they built, the structures they constructed, the middens of shells and bones that mark long occupation of a place, all of it is sitting on the continental shelf, in water ranging from shallow to very deep, covered by sediment and marine growth, invisible to any survey that cannot get down to that level. The archaeology of the original Australian coastal occupation is almost entirely missing from the record, not because it does not exist, but because it is underwater. This is the foundational problem of Australian coastal archaeology. The people came from the sea, or rather, they came through an ocean crossing, and they lived on the coast, and the coast is gone. What survives on land, in caves and rock shelters and inland sites, represents only a fraction of what these communities were doing and building and thinking. The coastal sites, where populations would have been densest, where the economy would have been richest, where the technology would have been most sophisticated, those sites are drowned. And nobody has done a systematic survey of the Australian continental shelf to find them. That is not an exaggeration. Systematic underwater archaeological survey of the kind that would be required to locate and document submerged Australian coastal sites has not been done. There have been targeted investigations at specific locations. There has been reconnaissance work, there has been consultation with Aboriginal communities about traditions that might point to specific locations, but the comprehensive program of underwater survey that the scale of the question demands has not happened. The resources are not there, the institutional will has been inconsistent, and the technical challenges are real. But the absence of investigation is not the same as the absence of remains. What has been found in the targeted work that has been done is suggestive enough to make the absence of comprehensive investigation look like a genuine gap in human knowledge. In Murujuga, on the Dampier Archipelago off the Pilbara coast of Western Australia, there is a concentration of rock art that represents the largest collection of petroglyphs on Earth. More than 1 million individual engravings have been documented there. The site has been inscribed on the Australian National Heritage List and is the subject of ongoing UNESCO World Heritage consideration. The images span a remarkable range of subjects and styles, with the oldest images potentially dating back 40,000 years, and some images depicting animals and environments that have not existed in that region for thousands of years. Among those images are depictions of what appear to be therapsids, the group of mammal-like reptiles that includes the ancestors of modern mammals, and which went extinct hundreds of millions of years ago. Mainstream archaeology treats those particular images with appropriate caution, but other images on the Murujuga rocks depict animals that were unambiguously real and recent, including the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, which disappeared from the Australian mainland roughly 3,000 years ago but persisted in Tasmania until the 1930s. The presence of thylacine images at Murujuga is confirmed and accepted. It means the people making these images had first-hand knowledge of an animal that modern Australians only know from photographs. But the most immediately significant thing about Murujuga, for the purposes of understanding the coastal dimension of Australian prehistory, is not the age of the art or the animals it depicts. It is the fact that Murujuga is now an archipelago, a series of islands, that was, during the glacial maximum, part of the mainland coast. The people who created the earliest layers of rock art at Murujuga were not making art on an island. They were making art on a coastal headland that jutted into a broad and accessible coastal plain. The ocean that surrounds the islands today was land. And when the sea rose, the people on that headland watched it transform around them, watched the low-lying land disappear, watched their connection to the mainland narrow and then vanish, watched the plain they had walked on and hunted on and gathered from sink below the water. They kept making art through all of that. The art record at Murujuga is essentially continuous across thousands of years of dramatic coastal transformation. and the images themselves may contain information about what was happening, about the land that was disappearing, about the animals that were changing their range as the climate shifted. Nobody has done the full analysis. The rock art corpus at Murujuga is so large, and the individual images so numerous, that complete documentation is still ongoing. What has been documented, partially, is extraordinary enough. What has not yet been fully examined may be more extraordinary still. Move south along the Western Australian coast, past the Pilbara, past Shark Bay, past the Abrolhos Islands, and you reach a series of coastal environments that are among the most unusual in the world, and that have yielded some of the most unexpected findings in Australian coastal archaeology. The Abrolhos Islands themselves, a group of coral and limestone islands about 60 kilometers offshore from Geraldton, sit above a submerged reef system that extends far beyond the visible islands. During low sea level periods, that reef system was substantially more exposed, and the islands were larger and more connected to the mainland by lower sea levels. The Abrolhos are most famous in Australian history for the Batavia wreck of 1629, the Dutch East India Company ship that was wrecked there and whose survivors carried out one of the worst documented atrocities of the colonial era. But beneath the colonial history, the Abrolhos have another story. Archaeological work on the islands has documented Aboriginal occupation extending back thousands of years, to periods when the sea level was different and the islands were larger. The exact nature and extent of that occupation is not fully understood. What is understood is that Aboriginal people were crossing the waters to these islands, that they maintained connections between the islands and the mainland across significant stretches of open ocean, and that the marine resources of the Abrolhos were part of the economic world of the coastal peoples of that region for a very long time. The presence of Aboriginal occupation on offshore islands along the Western Australian coast is not limited to the Abrolhos. Multiple island groups along the WA coast show evidence of Aboriginal use and occupation predating European contact. The Montebello Islands, where Australia conducted nuclear tests in the 1950s, have archaeological sites. The Lacepede Islands show evidence of Aboriginal use. The pattern is consistent. Coastal Aboriginal communities were not confined to the mainland shoreline. They were maritime peoples who moved across the water, who had the technology and the knowledge to do so, and who incorporated the islands and the offshore reef systems into their economic and cultural world. This matters enormously for understanding what was happening on and around the Australian coast before the sea level rise. If Aboriginal maritime communities were capable of accessing offshore islands across open water in the last few thousand years, with the tools and traditions available to them in that period, what were the communities of 30,000 or 40,000 years ago doing? The technology and knowledge required for the original colonization of Australia is itself remarkable. Getting to Australia from Southeast Asia, even at the lowest sea levels of the glacial maximum, required crossing at least 60 to 90 kilometers of open ocean. Some models suggest the crossing may have been even longer, depending on the specific route taken and the specific period of the crossing. Whatever route was used, the original Australians were not drift migrants. They were navigators. They had watercraft capable of carrying people, and enough people to found a viable population across open ocean. The watercraft themselves have not survived. Wood and other organic materials do not preserve across 50,000 years in the archaeological record under normal conditions. We have no direct evidence of what the craft looked like, but we have indirect evidence in the sophistication of the people who built them. The genetic evidence tells us that the founding population of Australia was large enough to establish a viable community, which means the crossings were not one-time accidents, but were repeated and deliberate, involving enough people to sustain a founding population. The ecological evidence tells us that the people who arrived in Australia already had knowledge of marine resources, because the earliest coastal sites that have been excavated show exploitation of marine environments from the earliest occupation layers. The geographic evidence tells us that whoever made these crossings had a concept of land beyond the horizon, knowledge of ocean conditions, and the practical ability to navigate toward a destination they had not been to before. None of that is consistent with a picture of primitive, barely surviving people stumbling onto an unknown continent by accident. What it describes is sophisticated maritime capability in one of the oldest human populations outside Africa. And the coastal culture that capability produced, with 50,000 years to develop before the colonial period disrupted it, has not been adequately studied. Moving to the northern coast of Australia, the Kimberley region offers some of the most remarkable and least understood examples of ancient coastal culture anywhere in the world. The Kimberley coast is extraordinary terrain, a fractured and complex landscape of ranges, gorges, offshore islands, and submerged reefs that extends for thousands of kilometers. The tidal range in parts of the Kimberley is among the largest in the world, with tides exceeding 10 meters in some locations, creating coastal environments that change dramatically between high and low water. The archaeology of the Kimberley is, by the admission of the researchers who work there, significantly incomplete. Access is difficult, the terrain is harsh, and the survey coverage that exists represents a fraction of what would be required to characterize the region. What has been found in the Kimberley is enough to establish that the region contains deep and complex human history. Rock shelters and caves throughout the inland Kimberley show occupation extending tens of thousands of years. The rock art traditions of the Kimberley are among the oldest and most elaborately developed in the world, with the Guion figures, sometimes called Bradshaw figures, after the European who first brought them to wide attention in the colonial period, representing a tradition of figure painting that is technically sophisticated, stylistically distinct, and poorly dated. Some researchers have proposed, on the basis of the traces of fossilized wasp nests that overlay and underlie some of the figures, that the Guion tradition may have begun more than 17,000 years ago. Others dispute this and argue for more recent dates. The controversy is genuine and the questions are not resolved. What is less often discussed in the public-facing conversation about the Guion figures is the coastal dimension. The rock shelters and ranges where these figures are found are now inland, but the coastline has moved. The Kimberley during the glacial maximum extended substantially further out to sea. The people creating the earliest Guion images were not living in an inland environment in the way a modern visitor would experience it. They were living in a landscape that was connected to an extensive coastal plain that no longer exists. The connection between the Guion tradition and the maritime world of the Kimberley coast is not something that has been systematically investigated. There is also the question of the Wandjina figures, the distinctive white-faced figures with large eyes and no mouths that appear throughout the Kimberley rock art tradition and that continue to be painted and maintained by Ngarinyin, Wunumbal, and Warora communities today, making this one of the few rock art traditions in the world that is still actively practiced by communities with a direct cultural connection to the original artists. The Wandjina are rain and cloud beings in the spiritual traditions of the Kimberley communities. They are associated with seasonal weather, with the monsoon, with the fertility that comes with rain. They are depicted in ways that have invited comparison to images from other parts of the world. Comparisons that Aboriginal communities themselves generally do not find meaningful or respectful, but that reflect a widespread and persistent observation that the iconography of the Wandjina figures shares structural features with certain ancient depictions from Egypt, from ancient Mesopotamia, and from other traditions separated from Australia by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The mainstream position is that these similarities are examples of convergent iconographic development, the same basic visual elements arriving at by separate traditions working with the same human visual system and the same representational challenges. That explanation may be entirely correct, but it has not been subjected to the same rigorous testing that other questions in Australian coastal archaeology have been, because the question is sensitive, because the history of non-Indigenous scholars making claims about Aboriginal culture that override Aboriginal understandings is a real and damaging history, and because the methaneukastral tools for testing questions of this kind across such large distances and time periods are genuinely limited. What is not in dispute is that the Kimberley rock art tradition is one of the most significant bodies of ancient human visual expression on Earth, that it is associated with a maritime coastal culture of great sophistication and antiquity, and that the coastal dimension of that culture, the seaward-facing world of the Kimberley communities during the periods when sea level was lower and the coastal plain extended outward, is almost entirely undocumented. The northern coast of Australia has one more significant feature that is worth examining in detail: the Macassan connection. Beginning somewhere around the 17th century and continuing until 1906, when Australian colonial authorities ended the practice, fishermen from Makassar, in what is now the Indonesian province of South Sulawesi, made annual voyages to the northern coast of Australia to harvest sea cucumbers, known in the trade as trepang, which were dried and sold to Chinese traders. These voyages were not occasional or incidental. They were systematic, regular, and sustained over at least 300 years. The Macassans built seasonal camps on the Australian coast, processed their catch there, traded with Aboriginal communities, sometimes formed long-term relationships with those communities, and left behind a significant material and cultural imprint. The evidence for the Macassan contact is substantial and varied. Archaeological sites on the northern Australian coast contain tamarind trees, the seeds of which were brought by the Macassans, which have now naturalized in the Australian coastal environment. They contain remnants of Macassan pottery, of the clay fireplaces used for boiling and smoking trepang, of iron tools and glass. The rock art of the northern coast includes images of the distinctive prow, the sailing vessels the Macassans used, and some of those images are associated with other images in ways that suggest the arrival of these foreign visitors was a significant cultural event. Genetic analysis of northern Australian Aboriginal communities has found a signal of Macassan ancestry in some communities, confirming that contact was close enough and sustained enough to produce genetic exchange. None of this is disputed in mainstream scholarship. What is more complicated is the question of how much further back such contact may extend. The Macassan contact documented in the historical record begins in the 17th century by the most conservative estimates. But the sea routes the Macassans used to reach Australia were not invented in the 17th century. The technology and knowledge required to navigate those routes, understanding of monsoon patterns, of seasonal wind directions, of the geography of the island chain between Sulawesi and Australia, that knowledge took time to develop. How many centuries before the documented Macassan contact period did earlier, undocumented contacts occur between the populations of island Southeast Asia and the populations of northern Australia? This is not a fringe question. It has been raised by serious researchers working on Australian prehistory. The genetic data that shows a trace of South Asian ancestry in some Aboriginal Australian populations, a finding published in 2013 by researchers using genome-wide analysis and dated to approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, suggests that contact with populations outside Australia occurred long before the Macassan period. That signal has been debated, and its interpretation is contested, but it has not been explained away, and the debate continues in the peer-reviewed literature. What the northern coast of Australia presents, when you look at it carefully, is a picture of a coastline that was not isolated, it was connected. Connected to the island chains to the north, connected to the populations on those islands, connected across water routes that people had been navigating for thousands of years. The narrative of Australia as a continent sealed off from the rest of the world until 1788 is a narrative that applies to European knowledge of Australia, not to the actual connectivity of the northern Australian coast. The eastern coast of Australia presents a different set of questions, but questions no less significant. The Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral reef system on Earth, extends along the Queensland coast for more than 2,000 kilometres. It is one of the most biodiverse marine environments on the planet, and it sits above what was, during the glacial maximum, a broad coastal plain. The reef itself did not look anything like its modern form during the period of low sea levels. The coral structures that make up the reef grew upward as sea levels rose, tracking the rising water surface. The modern reef is built on the bones of earlier reef systems and earlier coastal landscapes. Under the reef, archaeologists have not looked in any systematic way. The technical challenges are extreme, and the reef system is protected environmental territory that complicates underwater survey. But Aboriginal communities whose traditional country includes the reef system maintain traditions that describe the landscape before it was reef, describe the plain that is now underwater, describe features of that drowned coastal landscape. Those traditions have not been systematically cross-referenced with the geological record of the reef in the way the southern Australian sea level traditions have been. The coastal communities of Queensland, before European contact, were among the most complex and well-organised Aboriginal societies documented by the earliest European observers. The communities of the coastal river valleys, the estuaries, and the reef edge were not the simple bands of wandering individuals that colonial ideology projected onto all Aboriginal communities. They were settled enough, or at least seasonally settled enough, to build and maintain the fish traps that have been documented at numerous locations along the Queensland coast. Some of those fish trap systems are large, complex, and require significant communal labour to construct and maintain. The fish traps of Brewarina on the Barwon River, while inland, are among the largest and most complex stone fish trap systems in the world, and they have been maintained over a period of time that Aboriginal tradition describes as extending back to the creation period. On the coast itself, stone fish trap systems have been documented at various locations. The tidal fish traps of various coastal communities use the tidal range to concentrate and capture fish in ways that required knowledge of tidal patterns, of fish behavior, of construction techniques adequate to build structures that would survive both the force of tidal flow and the periodic high-energy events of cyclone season. These were not simple barriers. They were engineered systems that represent sustained investment of communal labour and were maintained across generations. What none of the documentation of these systems has fully addressed is the question of the earlier systems. If coastal communities were building and maintaining sophisticated fish trap systems in the period documented by European observers, what were the equivalent communities doing 2,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago? The answer to that question is sitting on the continental shelf, or buried under coastal development, or in traditions that have not been shared with researchers. It is not in the published archaeological record. There is also the matter of the dugout canoe on the eastern coast. The bark canoe is the most documented watercraft technology of eastern Australian coastal communities in the colonial period, and bark canoes were real, capable, and used for coastal and offshore fishing and travel. But there is evidence that more complex watercraft were used, particularly by the communities of the Queensland coast who were in contact, directly or indirectly, with the traditions of Torres Strait. Torres Strait Islander communities used outrigger canoes, a more sophisticated watercraft technology associated with the island chain populations of the Pacific and Southeast Asian archipelago. The boundary between the bark canoe traditions of coastal Queensland and the outrigger canoe traditions of Torres Strait is not a fixed or simple one, and the question of how far south outrigger or more sophisticated canoe technology extended and how far back in time has not been resolved. Moving to the southeastern coast and Tasmania, the story becomes even more complex and in some ways more tragic. Tasmania was connected to the Australian mainland during the glacial maximum, forming the single landmass of what is sometimes called Greater Australia. Aboriginal people walked onto Tasmania, across land that is now the Bass Strait, settled the island, and built a culture there that has been dated archaeologically to at least 35,000 years ago and possibly earlier. Then, somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, the sea levels rose enough to flood the Bass Strait land bridge and cut Tasmania off from the mainland. The communities on either side of the newly formed strait were separated. The Tasmanian Aboriginal people, isolated on an island they could no longer leave without ocean-capable watercraft, developed and maintained their culture for 10,000 years in isolation. And then, in the 1830s, that culture was systematically destroyed in what the historian James Boyce and others have characterized as one of the most complete acts of ethnic destruction in documented history. By the 1870s, the last fluent speakers of the Tasmanian Aboriginal languages were dying. By the 1880s, those languages were gone. The tragedy of what was lost goes beyond the human suffering, as enormous as that suffering was. It includes the loss of 10,000 years of accumulated coastal knowledge specific to Tasmania, knowledge of the strait crossing, of the currents and winds and weather patterns of the Bass Strait, knowledge that coastal Tasmanian communities had been developing and refining for all the time they had been living on that coast. When the sea cut Tasmania off, the communities on the island faced a new reality. They no longer had access to stone sources from the mainland that they had previously used. Their stone tool technology changed in response, adapting to local materials. They also, at some point in the island period, stopped eating finned fish. This is one of the more puzzling findings in Tasmanian archaeology. Evidence of finned fish consumption in Tasmanian archaeological sites disappears from the record beginning several thousand years ago, despite the fact that Tasmanian waters were rich in finned fish that were certainly accessible. Nobody has fully explained why. The absence of finned fish from the Tasmanian diet was noted by early European observers, and it was the source of considerable colonial condescension, interpreted as evidence of limited intelligence or capability. Modern researchers have proposed various explanations, including the possibility that the decision not to eat finned fish was cultural and intentional rather than technological, a ritual restriction rather than an inability. The technology for catching finned fish, including plant fiber lines and hook equivalents, was within reach of the material culture available in Tasmania. The decision not to catch them may have been a choice. But the reasoning behind that choice, whatever it was, died with the language speakers who could have explained it. What has survived from Tasmanian Aboriginal culture is fragmentary but significant. The shell middens of the Tasmanian coast, the heaped remains of shellfish that fed coastal communities across thousands of years, are among the most extensive and well-studied coastal archaeological records in Australia. Some of those middens represent continuous or nearly continuous occupation of specific coastal locations across thousands of years. The midden sequences at sites like Rocky Cape and Cave Bay Cave contain evidence of changing coastal economies, changing species use, and changing environmental conditions across deep time. They are, in effect, a record of how one coastal community adapted to the same kinds of changes: rising sea levels, shifting marine ecologies, changing climate, that coastal communities elsewhere in Australia experienced, but whose records have not been as well preserved. The woman known historically as Truganini, who died in 1876 and was for a long time described in colonial accounts as the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal person, an inadequate and contested description, but one that reflects the colonial devastation of her community, had grown up on the coast. Her father was described as a leader of the Liloquani people of the Bruny Island area. She was a coastal person, the descendant of thousands of years of coastal people, and she watched the world her ancestors had built disappear within a single lifetime. The knowledge she carried of the coast, of the strait, of 10,000 years of specifically Tasmanian coastal understanding, died with her and with the others of her generation, whose lives the colonial period ended or diminished beyond recovery. What did not entirely die was the genetic and cultural connection. Communities of Tasmanian Aboriginal descent continue to exist today. They maintain their connection to their heritage and their country. And the research they have been involved in, in partnership with archaeologists and historians who work respectfully with them, has begun to recover some of what the colonial record obscured or destroyed. But the coastal knowledge systems, the deep-time understanding of the Tasmanian shoreline and its waters, those are among the hardest things to recover when the transmission chain has been broken. The South Australian coast offers yet another dimension of the story. The area around the Murray River mouth and the Coorong is one of the richest archaeological landscapes in Australia, and one that directly connects to the question of how far back coastal cultures of significant complexity extend. The Murray-Darling Basin, the vast river system that drains the interior of southeastern Australia, meets the Southern Ocean at Encounter Bay, and the region around that meeting point, including the Coorong, the long coastal lagoon south of the Murray mouth, was one of the most productive environments in pre-contact Australia. The communities of the Lower Murray region built large, settled villages. They fished the river and the coastal waters. They harvested the enormous resources of the Coorong. They buried their dead in ways that created some of the most significant burial sites in Australian prehistory. At Runka, on the Murray River above its mouth, archaeologists excavated a burial site that contained more than 200 individual burials, representing occupation from approximately 7,000 years ago to the recent Aboriginal period. The burials showed evidence of elaborate mortuary practice, of social differentiation reflected in the goods buried with individuals, of health profiles that indicated a population well nourished by the rich resources of the Murray Corridor. Runka is extraordinary, but it is representative of a broader pattern of large, complex communities in the Murray-Darling region that challenges the simple stereotype of small wandering bands. On the coast of Victoria, moving east from the Murray mouth, the region around Portland in Western Victoria has been the site of significant research that has changed the understanding of pre-contact Aboriginal land use. At Toolondo, and at related sites in the Western District of Victoria, researchers in the 1980s documented an extensive network of drainage channels and aquaculture infrastructure associated with the Gunditjmara people that predates European settlement by hundreds of years. The system used volcanic landscape features around Lake Condah to manage the movement of short-finned eels, a species of enormous nutritional importance to the Gunditjmara, in ways that amount to systematic aquaculture. Eel traps, channels, weirs, and holding ponds were constructed using stone across a landscape of several square kilometers, and the Gunditjmara built permanent stone houses near the aquaculture infrastructure because the resource was reliable enough and rich enough to support permanent settlement. The system at Lake Condah, now known as Budge Bim, was recognized with UNESCO World Heritage inscription in 2019, making it only the third site in Australia to be recognized solely for its cultural and historical significance, rather than also for natural values. The UNESCO recognition describes the Budge Bim cultural landscape as demonstrating one of the world's oldest and largest aquaculture systems, dating to at least 6,600 years ago, based on the geological date of the lava flow over which the system was constructed. That is older than the pyramids of Egypt. It predates the construction of Stonehenge. It is older than the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, and it is not an isolated curiosity. It is part of a pattern of resource management and landscape modification across the coastal and near-coastal regions of Australia that has been radically underestimated in conventional accounts of pre-contact Aboriginal life. The coastal and estuarine fish trap systems that have been documented along the New South Wales coast, at Ballina, at Yamba, at various points in the estuaries of the North Coast rivers, and the large stone fish trap systems like those at Brewarina Inland, exist along a gradient of ecological and engineering sophistication that is only beginning to be understood in its full extent. The research investment in understanding these systems has been limited and patchy. Many sites have been partially destroyed by coastal development, by dredging, by the alteration of tidal and river flow regimes by dams and levees. What survives is documented in varying levels of detail. What has been destroyed or altered beyond recognition represents a further loss in the archaeological record that was already dramatically truncated by the sea level rise at the end of the glacial period. There is also the matter of what is still being found. In 2023, underwater archaeologists working in collaboration with the Newell and Bardi Jawi communities off the Kimberley coast of Western Australia found stone artifacts on the sea floor and water several meters deep. Those artifacts, identified on the basis of their morphology as tools or tool production waste consistent with Aboriginal stone tool technology, were lying on what was, during the period of low sea level, a terrestrial landscape. The find is not yet fully analysed or published, but it represents, if confirmed, one of the first direct archaeological findings from the submerged Australian coastal landscape, the first material evidence from the coast that the earliest Australians actually lived on. This is the state of the field. After more than 2 centuries of European scholarship on Australia, after generations of archaeological investigation, after all the work that has been done, researchers are just now beginning to find the material traces of the people who lived on the coast that is now underwater, just now beginning to develop the underwater survey capability and the collaborative frameworks with Indigenous communities that would be required to systematically investigate the drowned Australian coast. And what they are finding, even in the earliest and most preliminary stages of that investigation, is consistent with the picture that the oral traditions and the inland archaeology have been building for decades, that the coastal communities of Australia were sophisticated, organised and capable far beyond what colonial-era accounts suggested, and that the coastal dimension of Australian prehistory is one of the largest unexplored territories in human archaeological knowledge. The question that hangs over all of this is not whether there is more to find. There clearly is. The question is what kind of more. Is it simply more of what is already known, more complex societies, more impressive resource management systems, more sophisticated oral knowledge traditions? Or is there something qualitatively different waiting on that shelf, something that would require not just an expansion but a revision of the standard account of what was happening on the Australian coast before the sea rose? The suggestive evidence comes from several directions. First, there are the anomalous stone arrangements. Along various points of the Australian coastline, researchers and community members have noted the existence of stone arrangements that do not fit easily into any of the documented categories of Aboriginal stone structure. Some of these have been formally reported and are subject to ongoing investigation. Others exist in the knowledge of coastal communities but have not been systematically surveyed. The problem is that many coastal stone arrangements, if they existed, would be difficult to distinguish from natural rock formations without careful examination, and the survey coverage of the Australian coast for this category of evidence is minimal. Second, there are the recurring reports of unusual underwater features from divers and fishers who work the continental shelf. Australia has an extensive commercial and recreational diving community, and over the decades there have been reports, mostly informal, sometimes submitted to state maritime heritage authorities, of linear stone features, of arrangements of rocks that appear non-natural, of submerged landscapes with features inconsistent with pure geological formation. The overwhelming majority of these reports, when investigated, have conventional explanations, but the investigation rate is low. Most reports are not followed up with the systematic examination that would be required to confirm or rule out an archaeological explanation. The technical difficulty of underwater survey, the cost, and the institutional bandwidth available for this kind of work mean that informal reports from divers largely remain informal. Third, there is the problem of the boat. The original colonization of Australia required watercraft. That is established. The level of maritime capability implied by the colonization is significant. A founding population, large enough to sustain itself, transported across open ocean, implies not one or a few craft, but a sustained series of crossings. Sustained crossings imply regular maritime activity, established routes, navigational knowledge. That level of maritime capability developed over the millennia of the original colonization period and then continued by communities living on a rich and productive coast for 50,000 years should have produced a robust tradition of ocean-going activity. What happened to it? In the period documented by European observers, most coastal Aboriginal communities did not use ocean-going watercraft beyond what was required for relatively near-shore fishing and inter-island travel. The outrigger and more sophisticated watercraft traditions were present in Torres Strait and the far north, where the connection to Southeast Asian maritime traditions was most direct. But the broader tradition of ocean-going watercraft, if it existed in earlier periods, is not visible in the record of recent centuries. Why? One possibility is that the tradition declined over time, as the ecological richness of the coast made long-distance ocean voyaging less necessary. If the coastal resources were sufficient to sustain communities without long-distance maritime trade or exploration, the incentive to maintain ocean-going capability might have diminished. Another possibility is that the disruption caused by the sea level rise itself, which was rapid enough on a human scale to displace communities repeatedly over the period of its maximum rise, disrupted the transmission of maritime knowledge in ways that were not recovered. A third possibility is that the tradition of more sophisticated maritime capability persisted longer than the European contact record shows. In the communities that were most severely affected by epidemic disease and colonial violence in the early contact period, those communities being disproportionately the coastal ones that had first and most intense contact with European settlers. The epidemic question is one of the least discussed aspects of Australian coastal prehistory, because its effects belong to the historical rather than the prehistoric period, but its implications extend backward into the record. When the first European settlements were established on the Australian coast in 1788, epidemic disease preceded and followed those settlements in ways that destroyed coastal communities at a catastrophic rate. Smallpox, the evidence suggests, reached some parts of the Australian coast before sustained European contact even began in those areas, spreading through trade and travel networks from the areas of initial contact. By the time systematic ethnographic observation of coastal Aboriginal communities began, those communities had already been through one or more epidemic episodes that may have killed the majority of their members. The people European observers were watching and recording were the survivors of a demographic catastrophe, not the representatives of fully functioning pre-contact societies. This matters for understanding what was lost. If a community loses 60 or 70 or 80% of its members in a single epidemic, the loss is not distributed evenly across the population. Older members, the people who carry the deepest layers of accumulated knowledge, the people who have lived long enough to have mastered the full complexity of coastal knowledge systems, are at greatest risk. Children and young people can survive in larger proportions, but children and young people have not yet had the time to fully receive the transmission of knowledge that their elders carry. In the Australian context, epidemic disease did not just kill people. It destroyed the transmission chain of knowledge systems that had been maintained across hundreds of generations. The knowledge went with the people who had it. What survived was the fraction that had already been transmitted to the survivors. How much of Australian coastal knowledge was lost in the epidemic period? Nobody knows. The question cannot be fully answered. But the pattern in other contexts where epidemic disease struck pre-contact or early contact populations suggests that the losses were extreme. In the Americas, where the epidemic impact of European contact has been studied in more detail, researchers have documented the loss of agricultural techniques, medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, and social organizational knowledge that took centuries to partially reconstruct, and in many cases was never recovered. The Australian case is likely comparable, and the coastal dimension of that loss, the knowledge of the sea, of navigation, of marine ecology, of the underwater landscape, may have been the most severely affected. This is the context in which the oral traditions that have survived must be understood. The stories that Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed documented, the 21 traditions describing submerged coastal landscapes, those stories survived epidemic disease and colonial violence, and the systematic disruption of transmission contexts that the missions and settlements imposed. They survived because they were embedded in ceremony, in song, in the most deeply maintained layers of cultural practice. But they are the survivors of a much larger corpus. How many equivalent stories, describing other coastlines, other geographical changes, other features of the drowned coastal landscape, did not survive? How much of what the sea took was taken twice, first by the water, and then by the disruption of the transmission that held its memory? The research community working on these questions is small, underfunded, and operating in a context where the methodological challenges are extreme and the political and ethical dimensions are complex. The relationship between academic researchers and Aboriginal communities in the context of coastal archaeology is not simple. There is a long history of research that extracted knowledge and material from Aboriginal communities without adequate consultation, consent, or benefit sharing. There is a long history of Aboriginal cultural heritage being treated as a resource for academic careers, rather than as the living property of the communities that maintain it. The current generation of researchers working on Australian coastal prehistory is generally aware of this history and is working to develop more equitable and collaborative frameworks. But the legacy of the earlier approach creates barriers to the kind of open and trusting relationship that would be required for communities to share their most significant knowledge with outside researchers. This means that some of the most important information about the Australian coast may already be known to Aboriginal communities, but is not in the published research literature, and may not enter it until research relationships mature to the point where communities feel confident that sharing that knowledge will not result in its appropriation or misuse. The pace of that maturation is not determined by researchers. It is determined by communities, appropriately. And it is a pace that the urgency of the research questions does not get to override. Meanwhile, the coast itself continues to change. Current sea level rise, driven by climate change, is affecting the very areas where the oral traditions of sea level change are strongest. The communities of Northern Australia, of the Torres Strait Islands, of the Kimberley coast, are watching the sea rise again. The Torres Strait Islands are among the most directly threatened communities in the world by current sea level rise, and the Torres Strait Islander people, whose traditions include knowledge of the last time the sea came up dramatically, are facing the prospect of watching their islands disappear in a repetition of what their oral traditions describe happening to their ancestors. The knowledge of how communities survived and adapted in the past, embedded in those traditions, has never been more relevant. And the window for documenting, protecting, and acting on that knowledge is narrowing. For researchers trying to understand the Australian coast, the combination of all these threads creates a picture that is simultaneously clear in its broad outlines and frustratingly incomplete in its details. The broad outlines are: Australia's coast was occupied for 50,000 years or more by sophisticated communities with deep knowledge of the sea, complex economic and social systems, and the ability to maintain and transmit knowledge over time, scales that no other documented knowledge tradition has achieved. The sea level rise at the end of the last ice age drowned the most archaeologically rich period of that occupation. The epidemic disease and colonial disruption of the contact period severely damaged the transmission systems that preserved knowledge of that occupation. The research investigation of the drowned coast has barely begun. The incomplete details are nearly everything else. Where exactly did the first Australians arrive, and on what kind of watercraft, and by what route? What was the coastal economy of the communities that lived on the shelf between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago? What did they build, and where, and how? What do the oral traditions that have not yet been systematically examined with modern geological methods tell us about the drowned landscape? What is sitting on the continental shelf, in 10 meters or 20 meters of water, that has not been looked at? What does the Kimberley rock art tell us about the coastal world that existed when those images were first painted? What was the nature of the contact between the Northern Australian communities and the populations of island Southeast Asia in the millennia before the documented Macassan period? These questions are not unanswerable in principle. They require resources, time, technology, and above all, the development of research relationships with Aboriginal communities based on genuine respect and equity. The answers, when they come, are not going to fit neatly into the standard story of Australian prehistory that most people have absorbed. The standard story is too thin for what the evidence suggests. What the evidence suggests is that the oldest continuously occupied coastline on Earth has a history more complex, more sophisticated, and more connected to the wider world of human maritime activity than has been recognized. The sea took most of the direct evidence for that history, rising slowly over thousands of years and swallowing the places where the evidence had been left. But the sea is not impermeable to investigation. The tools exist or are being developed to survey the continental shelf, to identify and document submerged sites, to recover material from the seafloor in ways that preserve its context. The communities whose traditions hold the other kind of evidence, the oral record of what the drowned coast was like and what happened when the sea rose, are there and are willing, in the right circumstances, to be partners in the research. And the questions themselves, the deep questions about who these people were and what they built and what they knew, are questions that the rest of the world is only now beginning to ask, with anything like the seriousness they deserve. The coast of Australia is not finished giving up its secrets. The deeper the investigation goes, the more complicated the picture becomes. And the more complicated the picture becomes, the more it looks like the oldest coastline in the human world holds answers not just about Australian prehistory, but about human maritime capability, about the transmission of knowledge across deep time, about the relationship between oral tradition and geological record, and about what it means to have lived for 50,000 years on a coastline that the sea ultimately took away. We are only now learning to ask the right questions, and what the coast has already told us, in the research that has been done so far, suggests that the answers, when they fully emerge, will change the story we tell about ourselves, about who we were and how long we have been keeping track of the world we live in, and how much of what we thought we had lost we might still be able to recover. The water remembers, the stone remembers, the stories that survived remembered for 10,000 years when the Academy had not yet thought to ask. The deeper we dig into Australia's coast, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more it looks like the beginning of something we have not yet had the courage to fully investigate. There is another dimension to the Australian coastal story that the standard archaeological narrative touches on only briefly, and that is the question of what the coastline meant, in a spiritual and cosmological sense, to the communities that lived along it. This is not a marginal or supplementary question. For communities that had been living on a coastline for 50,000 years, whose entire economic and cultural life was organized around the relationship between land and sea, between fresh water and salt water, between the world above and the world below the surface of the ocean, the spiritual and cosmological dimensions of the coast were not separate from the practical dimensions. They were the same thing. The knowledge of how to fish, of where the good fishing grounds were, of how the tides behaved and when the rains would come, and what the behavior of certain species indicated about the state of the broader marine environment, that knowledge was embedded in the spiritual framework. You cannot separate them without destroying both. This is one of the reasons that purely material archaeology focused on the recovery of physical objects and the measurement of physical features, is insufficient on its own for understanding what happened on the Australian coast. The most important things that were happening on that coast, the things that organized and gave meaning to everything else, were not stored in objects. They were stored in relationships, in ceremonial obligations, in the knowledge of sacred geography that told people which places were important and why, and what your relationship to those places was, and what responsibilities you carried as a person who belonged to that country. The concept of country in Aboriginal Australia is not equivalent to the European concept of territory. Country is not simply a tract of land that a group controls or uses. Country is a living relationship. Country is the place that knows you, that you are responsible for, that has obligations toward you as you have obligations toward it. The coast is country. The sea is country. The offshore islands are country. The reef is country. The animals that live in the sea are part of country. The plants that grow on the shore, the dunes, the estuaries, the tidal flats, all of it is country. And the people who belong to that country carry knowledge of it that is simultaneously ecological, historical, spiritual, and personal in a way that has no equivalent in European traditions of land relationship. When the sea rose and swallowed coastal country, it did not simply take land. It took sacred places. It took places where ceremonies were performed, where the stories of the creation period had happened, where the relationships between the human world and the spirit world were most directly accessible. The grief of that loss, across hundreds of generations of people watching the water take what had been theirs, is not something that can be quantified archaeologically. But it is visible in the oral traditions, in the way the memories of those places were maintained with such care and accuracy across so many thousands of years. You do not maintain a precise description of a submerged island or a drowned estuary for 7,000 years unless the place matters deeply. Unless the loss of it is still felt, still present in the cultural life of the community, still worth preserving as a reminder of what was and what was lost. The traditions that describe the sea level rise in those communities are not, in their own context, primarily geological data. They are expressions of relationship to a landscape that no longer exists in its original form, expressions of continuity across the break that the rising sea created, expressions of the determination to maintain the connection to country even when that country is underwater. The fact that those traditions happen to contain accurate geological information is, from one angle, almost incidental. The accuracy is a byproduct of the precision with which the traditions were maintained for other reasons rooted in the spiritual and relational dimensions of country that the geological analysis does not fully capture. This matters for thinking about what investigation of the Australian coastal record should look like. An investigation that treats the oral traditions purely as data sources, extracting the geological information and leaving the rest, is both extractive in an ethically problematic sense and methodologically incomplete. The full picture of what was happening on the Australian coast includes the spiritual and relational dimensions that the geological data alone cannot capture. And the communities that maintain those traditions are the ones who understand both dimensions, not just the one that maps onto categories academic researchers already recognize. The Yolngu people of northeast Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory represent one of the most extensively documented Aboriginal communities in terms of their relationship to the Northern Australian coast, and their case illustrates some of the specific ways that coastal country functions as a complex, multi-layered system of knowledge. Yolngu country includes large stretches of the Arnhem Land coast, the offshore islands, and the adjacent marine environments of the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Arafura Sea. The Yolngu had documented contact with the Macassan trepang fishes over several centuries and incorporated elements of that contact into their ceremonial and artistic traditions. They also maintain a complex ceremonial geography that maps onto the specific features of their coastal country, associating different places with different ancestral beings, different clans, different ceremonial knowledge, and different responsibilities. The Yolngu bark painting tradition, which began being collected by non-Indigenous institutions in the 1950s and 1960s, contains encoded geographic and ecological information about coastal and marine environments that is not immediately legible to outside viewers. The visual language of Yolngu bark painting is not simply decorative. It encodes information about the relationships between places, between ancestral beings and geographical features, between the tidal patterns and the behavior of fish, and the movements of weather systems. Researchers who have worked carefully with Yolngu artists and knowledge holders to understand the content of those paintings have found layers of information that are not visible to someone encountering the work without that guidance. The Yolngu case is relatively well documented by Australian standards because Yolngu communities made strategic decisions to engage with outside institutions in ways that would allow them to assert their own rights and interests, and those decisions created a record of engagement that is unusually detailed. The Yolngu have been involved in land rights cases that produced extensive legal documentation of their country and their relationship to it. They have worked with filmmakers, with researchers, with artists from outside their communities. The result is a body of documentation that gives outside observers more access to the content of Yolngu coastal knowledge than is available for most Aboriginal communities. But even in the Yolngu case, the documentation is partial. The deepest layers of ceremonial knowledge are restricted, shared only within the appropriate ceremonial contexts with the appropriate people. The sacred geography of Yolngu coastal country is not fully accessible to outside researchers, and it should not be. What is accessible is enough to make clear that the coastal knowledge system of the Yolngu is extraordinarily complex, that it encodes information about the marine environment in ways that have direct practical applications for fishing, navigation, and ecological management, and that it represents a tradition of coastal knowledge that extends back through chains of transmission that are explicitly maintained and can in some cases be traced for many generations. What the Yolngu case illustrates is a general principle. The coastal knowledge systems of Aboriginal Australia are far more complex than their material traces suggest, and the material traces are far more fragmentary than the knowledge systems themselves. The oral and ceremonial traditions are the primary archive of Australian coastal history, and those traditions are held by living communities who have their own views about how that archive should be accessed, for what purposes, and under what conditions. The implication for research is significant. It means that advancing understanding of Australian coastal prehistory depends not primarily on more archaeological fieldwork, though more fieldwork is certainly needed, but on developing the kinds of research relationships that allow communities to share what they know on their own terms in ways that serve their own interests as well as the interests of academic inquiry. It means that the most important resources for understanding the Australian coast are not in museums or university archives or government records. They are in the knowledge held by Aboriginal people who belong to coastal country. Moving from the methodological to the specific, there are several particular features of the Australian coastal landscape that deserve focused attention because they exemplify the kinds of questions that remain genuinely open and that have the potential to significantly revise current understanding. The first is the offshore reef systems of the southern Australian coast. The southern coast of Australia, from the Great Australian Bight across to the western Victorian coast, has an extensive continental shelf with several distinct submerged features that have been investigated to varying degrees. The Great Australian Bight itself is one of the most dramatic coastal features in the world, a long straight cliff line where the Nullarbor Plain meets the Southern Ocean in a wall of limestone that extends for hundreds of kilometres. The Bight was almost certainly a significant geographical feature during the glacial maximum, though with sea levels lower, the specific character of the coast would have been different. The caves in the limestone of the Nullarbor, some of which are accessible from the surface and some of which have been extensively explored by cavers, have not been systematically surveyed for archaeological evidence in their deeper sections. Cave systems in limestone are potential refugia for preservation of organic material that would not survive in open-air settings, and the Nullarbor caves are connected in some cases to the coast by underground passages that could have provided access routes or shelter to coastal people. The second is the submarine canyons. The Australian continental shelf is incised in numerous places by submarine canyons. Deep channels cut into the shelf during periods of low sea level by rivers that ran to the coast of the time. Those canyons extend from the current coastline outward to the continental slope, and in some cases they contain sediment sequences that are undisturbed by the geological and biological processes that affect most of the shelf. In the right canyon, in the right conditions, there could be preserved sediment from the period of low sea level that contains archaeological material. This has been recognized as a possibility in the literature, but systematic investigation of Australian submarine canyons for archaeological purposes has not been done. The third is the question of standing stones. In various locations along the Australian coast and in coastal hinterlands, there are arrangements of standing stones or individual stones in positions that appear to be the result of deliberate human placement that have not been adequately investigated. The culture of standing stone construction and arrangement is well documented in Aboriginal Australia, and it takes many forms for many purposes. Some standing stone arrangements are confirmed to be related to astronomical observation, as at Wurdi Yuwang in Victoria, where the stone arrangement is aligned with solar events and has been shown statistically to be inconsistent with random placement. Others are associated with ceremonial purposes, boundary markers, meeting places, or the marking of significant sites within the sacred geography of country. The distribution of these features along and near the coast, their relationship to the drowned coastal landscape, and their potential as evidence of the social and ceremonial geography of coastal communities before and during the sea level rise has not been systematically investigated. There is also the evidence from the sky. Aboriginal astronomy is one of the most recently recognized and rapidly developing fields within the broader study of Aboriginal knowledge systems. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Aboriginal traditions is extraordinarily sophisticated, and it has direct connections to the coastal context. Navigation by stars is an obvious application, and the stellar knowledge of coastal communities, particularly those in the north who were involved in ocean crossings or in maintaining orientation across the large Gulf systems, would have been highly developed. But beyond practical navigation, the astronomical traditions of coastal Aboriginal communities encode information about seasonality, about the ecological cycles of marine environments, and about the ceremonial calendar that organized coastal life. The Yolngu, for example, have an astronomical tradition that associates specific stars and star patterns with specific species and seasons. The appearance of the Pleiades in the eastern sky before dawn marks the beginning of the Macassan season, the period when the northwest monsoon winds would bring the Macassan trepang fishes from Indonesia. The behavior of the Southern Cross at different times of year encodes information about the seasonal cycles of marine species. The connection between astronomical knowledge and marine ecological knowledge is not metaphorical in Yolngu tradition. It is practical and precise, the kind of knowledge that a community dependent on the sea develops over thousands of years of careful observation. This astronomical knowledge was not developed recently. The frameworks within which the knowledge is organized, the association of specific stars with specific species, seasons, and ceremonial obligations, reflect patterns of observation and codification that are very old. Exactly how old is impossible to determine from the oral traditions themselves, but the sophistication and internal consistency of the systems suggest very long periods of development. And the coastal communities of Australia, with 50,000 years on the same coastline, watching the same sky, had more time to develop astronomical knowledge relevant to their specific coastal environments than any other human communities that can be documented. The question of whether any of that knowledge has survived in recoverable form, and whether it contains information about the coastal landscape that is no longer above sea level, is one that has not been systematically addressed. The Nunn and Reid approach, cross-referencing oral traditions with geological records, has been applied to traditions about sea level change. A similar approach applied to astronomical traditions, asking whether the stellar and seasonal knowledge of coastal Aboriginal communities encodes information about the coastal geography of earlier periods, has not been attempted. It may be methodologically very difficult, but it has not been tried. The emu in the sky is one of the most widely known examples of Australian Aboriginal astronomy to general audiences because it represents a conceptual approach to the night sky that is strikingly different from the European tradition. Rather than connecting individual bright stars into constellations defined by the stars themselves, the emu in the sky is defined by the dark clouds, the dark regions of the Milky Way that the eye perceives as irregular dark patches against the starfield. The dark cloud emu is a remarkable example of how the organization of astronomical knowledge can reflect the priorities and perceptions of a particular culture. A culture dependent on emus for food and other resources would attend to the emu in the sky in a way that a culture without that dependency would not. The dark cloud constellation system reflects an ecological relationship encoded in astronomical observation. Coastal communities would have attended to different features of the night sky, features associated with navigation, with the seasonal behavior of marine species, with the timing of fish runs and shellfish harvests. The astronomical knowledge of coastal communities may be different in character from the astronomical knowledge of inland communities, reflecting different ecological priorities and different uses of the sky as a system of information. That difference has not been characterized in any systematic way. The point of gathering all of these threads together is not to claim that there is a single spectacular missing piece of Australian coastal history waiting to be found, something that will dramatically overturn everything and reveal a lost civilization. That is not the story. The story is more complicated and in some ways more interesting than that. The story is that the coastal archaeological record of Australia is so incomplete. The investigation of that record is so recent and so preliminary, and the traditions that hold the other dimension of the record are so rich and so underutilized by researchers that the current picture of what was happening on the Australian coast before the colonial period is almost certainly wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being fabricated, but wrong in the sense of being seriously inadequate, a small and unrepresentative sample of a much larger reality. The archaeological and oral evidence that has been recovered so far points consistently towards sophisticated coastal communities engaged in complex economic activities, maintaining elaborate knowledge systems, interacting with one another across distances that require maritime capability, and responding creatively and effectively to the dramatic environmental changes imposed by the sea level rise. None of that fits the picture of simple, primitive, and isolated that colonial accounts imposed on Aboriginal Australia and that persisted in mainstream academic accounts far longer than it should have. The inadequacy of the current picture is not a comfortable thing to acknowledge. It means that decades of research, conducted by many serious and dedicated scholars, have produced results that will need to be substantially revised as better information becomes available. It means that the public understanding of Aboriginal Australian history, which even in its most generous forms, tends to underestimate the complexity and sophistication of pre-contact society, is even further from the reality than most people realize. It means that the significance of what was lost in the colonial period, the knowledge systems, the social organizations, the coastal economies, the astronomical traditions, the ceremonial geographies, is even greater than the already enormous significance that careful historians have attributed to it. For the communities who carry whatever has survived of those systems, the inadequacy of the current picture is not a new discovery. They have known for generations that what they carry is richer and deeper than the academic record acknowledges. The process of having that acknowledged by outside institutions is one that is ongoing, uneven, and sometimes painful, because it requires revisiting histories of extraction and dismissal that are not distant. They are within living memory in many cases. The people alive today in coastal Aboriginal communities have parents and grandparents who experienced directly the consequences of colonial policies that denied the validity of exactly the kinds of knowledge that researchers are now urgently trying to recover. The urgency is real. The climate is changing. Sea levels are rising again. The Torres Strait Islands that were separated from mainland New Guinea by the last sea level rise are facing the prospect of another inundation. The coastal communities of the Kimberley, the Arnhem Land coast, the Gulf country, the communities that carry the oral traditions that encode 10,000 and 12,000 years of memory about sea level change and coastal transformation, those communities are watching the climate change in their lifetimes, and they know what it means in a way that no amount of scientific modeling fully captures. They know what it means because the knowledge of what happened before, encoded in the traditions they maintain, is not abstract. It is specific, and it is present. What the Australian coast has to teach the world, if the world is willing to learn it, goes beyond archaeology. It goes beyond the academic question of how sophisticated pre-contact Aboriginal societies were, or what the underwater continental shelf contains, or how long accurate oral traditions can be maintained. What it has to teach is about resilience, about the capacity of human knowledge systems to survive catastrophic disruption, about the relationship between memory and landscape, and about what it means to carry responsibility for country across thousands of years of change. The communities that maintained accurate descriptions of drowned coastlines for 12,000 years were not doing so because they expected those descriptions to be vindicated by 20th century geology. They were doing so because the places they were describing were theirs, were part of who they were the ground from which their understanding of everything else grew. The water took the land, but it could not take the knowledge of the land as long as the people kept it, and they kept it. Through epidemics and colonial violence, and the systematic disruption of every institution that had maintained the transmission of that knowledge, they kept it. That is the deepest and most important thing that the deeper investigation of Australia's coast reveals. Not a lost civilization, not ancient contact with distant continents, not anomalous structures on the sea floor, though any of those things may yet be found. What it reveals is the extraordinary durability of human knowledge systems built on deep relationship to place, and the extraordinary cost of breaking those relationships violently and abruptly. The cost is still being reckoned, the recovery is still incomplete. And the coast, the drowned coast that holds the archaeological record of 50,000 years of human life on its shelf, is still there, waiting for the investigation it has not yet received. The water has not finished telling its story, and neither have the people who watched it rise. There remains one more dimension of the Australian coastal story that has not been adequately addressed in the research literature, and that is the question of what the earliest arrivals found when they got there. The original colonisation of Australia is typically framed as the story of how anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, crossed from island Southeast Asia to the Sahul landmass 50,000 to 65,000 years ago and established the founding population of what would become Aboriginal Australian culture. But that framing, while accurate as far as it goes, elides several questions that are worth asking directly. The first question is whether the Sahul landmass was already occupied when the first modern humans arrived. The answer, according to current evidence, is almost certainly no. The earlier hominid species, Homo erectus, had reached the eastern islands of Southeast Asia, but had not, as far as the evidence shows, made the ocean crossing to Australia. The crossing itself appears to have been beyond the capability of Homo erectus, even at the lowest sea levels of earlier glacial periods. The Sahul landmass, as far as the evidence currently shows, was empty of humans when the first modern humans arrived. This makes Australia one of the last major landmasses to be colonised by our species, and with the exception of the Americas and Antarctica, one of the most dramatically pristine environments our ancestors ever encountered. What they found was a continent that had evolved in isolation for 80 million years since the breakup of Gondwana. The megafauna of Sahul were, by any measure, extraordinary. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived, was the size of a hippopotamus. Procoptodon goliath, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood 2 meters tall. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was a powerful predator that has no equivalent in any living marsupial. Meolania platyceps, a giant tortoise, lived on the Australian mainland. Quincana, a land-dwelling crocodile, hunted on the plains. Wanumbi narracortensis, a giant constrictor snake, was longer than any snake alive today. Dromornis stertoni, a flightless bird, stood almost 3 meters tall and weighed 500 kilograms. None of these animals had ever encountered humans before. They had no inherited fear of human hunters. They were, in the language of ecologists, naive prey. Animals that had evolved without the predation pressure of human hunters and had no behavioral adaptations to cope with that kind of predation. The earliest Australians arrived into an environment where the prey did not run from them. where the megafauna were accessible in ways that no experienced prey species would allow, and where the hunting was, at least initially, extraordinarily easy. The consequences of that encounter were severe. By somewhere around 40,000 years ago, the Australian megafauna was in sharp decline. By around 46,000 years ago, most of the large species were gone. The exact timing and the exact causes are debated, and the debate is genuine and ongoing. The two main candidates are human hunting pressure and climate change, and most researchers today believe that some combination of the two was responsible, with different researchers weighting the factors differently. What is not debated is that the extinctions occurred within the period of human occupation of Australia, and that the correlation is not coincidental. For the coastal story, the megafauna extinctions matter because they shaped the ecosystems that coastal communities lived within. The coastal and estuarine environments of Australia before the megafauna extinctions were different in ways that are not fully characterized. Some of the megafauna species were coastal or near coastal in their habitat. Diprotodon was an animal of open woodland and grassland, and its distribution would have included coastal environments where those habitat types extended to the shore. Palorchestes, the so-called marsupial tapir, lived in forest environments, some of which were coastal. The giant goanna megalania, if its size estimates are correct, would have been a coastal predator as well as an inland one, as modern goannas of smaller size are coastal and estuarine animals. The specific ecology of the coastal megafauna has not been characterized in detail because the coastal sites where that ecology would be best documented are underwater. What is known is that the communities that arrived on the Australian coast 50,000 years ago spent the first several thousand years of their occupation in an ecological context that was dramatically different from the one that prevailed in the period documented by European observers. The megafauna were present. The landscape was shaped by the presence of megafaunal herbivores and predators in ways that the subsequent landscape was not. The fire ecology of the continent, which Aboriginal communities actively managed through controlled burning, was adapted to and adapted by the presence of large grazing animals that have since gone extinct. Understanding what the coast looked like in that earliest period of human occupation, what resources it offered, how communities organized their relationship to it, requires understanding an ecological context that is gone. That context is not recoverable archaeologically from the drowned coastal sites, because the methodology for underwater archaeological survey of this kind does not yet exist at the required scale. But it may be partially recoverable from the few inland sites that date to the earliest occupation period and that were in ecological contact with the coast, and from the paleontological record of the megafauna extinctions themselves, which has been studied with increasing precision using improved dating methods. The intersection of the human settlement timeline, the megafauna extinction timeline, and the coastal archaeology is a research frontier that is genuinely new and that has the potential to substantially revise understanding of the earliest period of Australian prehistory. There is one more specific claim that deserves careful examination because it has been made with some force in recent years and because its implications for the coastal story are significant. The claim that the evidence for human occupation of Australia may be older than 50,000 to 65,000 years, the range that most researchers currently accept. This is not a fringe claim from alternative archaeology sources. It appears in the peer-reviewed literature, most prominently in a 2017 paper in Nature describing the results of excavations at Majedba Bay in the Northern Territory, where sediment layers associated with human artifacts were dated using optically stimulated luminescence to approximately 65,000 years ago, and where some researchers interpret the dating results as potentially extending to 80,000 years ago or more. The Majedba results are contested. Other researchers argue that post-depositional movement of artifacts can produce apparently old dates for materials that are in fact younger. The dispute is technical and methodological, involving questions about the reliability of the dating methods used and the degree to which sediment disturbance might have mixed older and younger layers. It has not been resolved, and the scientific community remains genuinely divided. But the possibility that Australia was colonized earlier than the currently accepted date range is taken seriously enough by leading researchers that it cannot be dismissed. If the colonization was earlier than 65,000 years ago, if humans arrived in Australia 80,000 years ago or earlier, the implications for the coastal story are substantial. An earlier colonization means a longer period of coastal occupation before the sea level rise. It means communities developing and refining their coastal knowledge systems for longer before the flooded coastlines force changes. It means that the drowned coastal archaeological record, if it can ever be investigated, extends further back in time and is correspondingly richer. It means that the oral traditions documenting coastal geography might encode even older events than the 12,000-year-old sea level changes that Nunn and Reed identified, potentially extending into the much earlier glacial periods where sea levels were also different from the modern baseline. An earlier colonization also changes the relationship between the Australian founding population and the Denisovans, the third member of the human family, alongside Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, whose existence has been documented through ancient DNA analysis. Modern Aboriginal Australians carry a higher proportion of Denisovan DNA than any other living human population, with some analyses suggesting that up to 4% of the Aboriginal Australian genome has Denisovan ancestry. The Denisovan genetic signal in Aboriginal Australians is consistent with an admixture event somewhere along the migration route between Africa and Australia, most likely in island Southeast Asia, where Denisovan remains have been found. But the timing and geography of that admixture event are not fully resolved, and if the Australian colonization was earlier than currently thought, it may have occurred at a time when Denisovan populations were more widely distributed across Southeast Asia and the contact opportunity was correspondingly greater. The genetic data that documents the Denisovan ancestry in Aboriginal Australians is one of the most remarkable recent findings in human genetics, and its implications for the Australian coastal story are only beginning to be explored. The Denisovans were not a minor branch of the human family. They were a successful and widely distributed population that occupied large parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They were, from the evidence available, sophisticated enough to create ornaments and possibly to develop other symbolic behaviors. The communities that encountered them in Southeast Asia and interbred with them were not meeting a primitive or less capable lineage. They were meeting another human population with its own long history and its own accumulated knowledge of the environments it inhabited. The Denisovan genetic legacy carried into Australia by the founding population may have included biological adaptations that were specifically relevant to island, Southeast Asian, and coastal environments. Genetic analysis has shown that Tibetan populations carry a Denisovan genetic variant that helps them cope with high altitude. It is plausible, though not yet demonstrated, that the Denisovan genetic contribution to the Aboriginal Australian founding population included adaptations relevant to the coastal and maritime environments of island Southeast Asia, environments that the founding population had been navigating for some time before the final crossing to Sahul. If that is the case, the remarkable maritime capability implied by the Australian colonization is not simply a product of Homo sapiens' ingenuity alone. It may incorporate a Denisovan genetic contribution to the capability for coastal and maritime adaptation. This is speculative. The genetic tools for identifying functional adaptations from ancient admixture events are still being developed, and the specific question of what Denisovan genetic variants might have contributed to coastal adaptation in early Australians has not been studied. But it is a plausible direction for future research, and it illustrates the point that the Australian coastal story is connected to the broader story of human prehistory in the Asia-Pacific region in ways that have not been fully traced. The connection works in both directions. The Australian coastal story is shaped by what happened in Southeast Asia before the colonization, and the Australian coastal story shaped what happened in the Pacific afterward. The founding population that arrived in Australia and, within a similar period, in New Guinea, was part of the same broad movement of modern human populations into the Pacific region. The communities that developed on the Australian coast for tens of thousands of years were not sealed off from this broader regional context. The northern Australian coast in particular was part of the same interconnected network of island and coastal communities that extended through the Torres Strait and into Melanesia and beyond. The peopling of the Pacific, beyond Australia and New Guinea, is a later story. The islands of remote Oceania were not colonized until approximately 3,000 years ago, when the Austronesian-speaking Lapita people expanded out of the Bismarck archipelago and began the process of island colonization that eventually carried humans to Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. That expansion is well documented archaeologically, and it represents one of the most impressive maritime achievements in human history. But it was not conducted from a standing start. The Lapita people were the heirs of thousands of years of maritime tradition in the island's Southeast Asian and Melanesian region, and that tradition was shaped partly by the interaction between the Austronesian-speaking populations and the much older populations of coastal Australia and near Oceania. The relationships between early Australian coastal communities and the populations of New Guinea, of the Bismarck archipelago, of the Solomon Islands chain are not fully characterized. The genetic evidence shows that the populations of Australia and New Guinea share a common ancestor in the Sahul colonization event, and that they were connected across the Torres Strait for tens of thousands of years before rising sea levels separated them. The cultural connections that would have developed across those tens of thousands of years of connection have been difficult to trace because the period of connection is before the recent archaeological record is adequate in most of those areas. But the connection was real, and it means that the maritime traditions of early Australia and early New Guinea developed in relationship with each other, not in isolation. The implications of this for understanding the Australian coastal story are that the story is not contained within Australian borders. The coast of Australia was one part of a connected system of coastal and maritime cultures that extended across the Pacific and Southeast Asian region, and understanding any one part of that system requires understanding the broader regional context. The deep history of Australian coastal communities is part of the deep history of Pacific maritime culture in a way that has not been fully acknowledged or explored. All of this points to a conclusion that is simultaneously simple and challenging to accept. The Australian coast is the oldest continuously occupied coastline on Earth. The communities that lived on that coast developed knowledge systems, economic systems, social systems, and spiritual systems of extraordinary sophistication and depth over 50,000 or more years. The sea took most of the direct archaeological evidence for those systems when the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. The colonial period took much of the rest when it disrupted or destroyed the communities that maintained the oral and ceremonial traditions that were the other dimension of the record. What remains is remarkable and revealing, but it is a fraction of what existed, and the investigation of what remains, both in the communities that hold the surviving traditions and on the continental shelf where the material record is submerged, is still in its earliest stages. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. Not strange in the sense of alien or incomprehensible, but strange in the sense of surprising, of consistently exceeding what the standard account had prepared us to find. Every step of serious investigation into Australia's coastal past has revealed more complexity, more sophistication, and more connection to the broader human story than the previous level of investigation had suggested. There is no reason to expect that pattern to reverse when the investigation goes deeper. The continental shelf, the oral traditions, the astronomical knowledge, the ceremonial geographies of living coastal communities, the genetic record that encodes ancient encounters and ancient adaptations, all of these are sources that have barely been tapped. The coast remembers, the people remember, the water holds what the land could not, and the story that will emerge when all of it is finally, carefully, and respectfully read together will be one of the most significant revisions to our understanding of human prehistory that the 21st century produces. Not because it will reveal something monstrous or impossible, but because it will reveal something deeply human. The capacity of people to know their place in the world, to maintain that knowledge across catastrophic change, and to keep the memory of what was lost alive for those who come after. The deeper we dig into Australia's coast, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more it looks like we have only just begun to understand what happened here. What the investigation of the Australian coast ultimately demands is not simply more resources, though resources are urgently needed. It demands a different way of asking questions. The standard approach to archaeological investigation begins with what can be measured and works toward what can be inferred. It privileges physical evidence, stratified deposits, datable material, quantifiable data. That approach has produced genuine knowledge and will continue to produce more, but it is not adequate on its own for the Australian coastal question, because the most important dimension of what happened on that coast is not recoverable through physical evidence alone. The knowledge systems, the social organizations, the spiritual geographies, the specific ways that communities understood their relationship to the coast and to the sea, those things were not made of stone or bone. They were made of relationship, of language, of ceremony, of the accumulated understanding of 50,000 years of people paying attention to the same stretch of ocean. Recovering those things, even partially, requires a different kind of investigation. It requires listening. It requires extended engagement with the communities that have maintained whatever has survived of those traditions, on terms those communities define, with purposes those communities agree to, producing outcomes that serve those communities' interests as well as academic interests. It requires patience, because the development of the trust that would allow communities to share their deepest knowledge with outside researchers takes time and cannot be rushed by the urgency of academic timelines. It requires humility, because the people who carry the traditions know things about their country and their past that no amount of academic training prepares a researcher to know, and that the researcher's job is to learn, not to instruct. The history of the relationship between academic research and Aboriginal communities in Australia is not a history that inspires confidence that this kind of investigation will be easy, but there are examples of it working. The research that produced the Nunn and Reid paper on oral traditions and sea level was done in genuine collaboration with Aboriginal communities. The research on the Budj-Bim cultural landscape was done in partnership with the Gunditj Mara people, and the UNESCO World Heritage inscription reflects that partnership. The ongoing work in various parts of Northern Australia on the connection between Aboriginal astronomical knowledge and ecological knowledge involves researchers who have spent years developing relationships with communities. These examples exist. They are not the dominant mode, but they are the direction in which the field needs to move. The coastal communities of Aboriginal Australia have been waiting for most of the past 2.5 centuries for the rest of the world to understand what they already knew, that the coast is extraordinary, that the knowledge of the coast, maintained across 50,000 years, is a treasure that has no parallel anywhere else on Earth, that the loss of any part of that knowledge to epidemic disease, or colonial violence, or the simple failure of outside institutions to treat it as the significant intellectual and cultural heritage it is a loss that diminishes not just Aboriginal Australians but the entire human family. The sea that drowned the original coast is still there. The continental shelf that holds the physical evidence of 50,000 years of coastal life is still there. The communities that carry the other dimension of the record, the oral and ceremonial knowledge, the astronomical traditions, the ceremonial geographies, are still there. And the questions that remain open about what was on that coast before the sea rose, about who those people were and what they built and what they knew, are still there. They are among the most important unanswered questions in the study of human prehistory. The deeper the investigation goes, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more certain it becomes that the standard account has not yet caught up to the reality. The coast of Australia is not simply the oldest continuously occupied coastline on Earth. It is the place where, if we are willing to look carefully enough and listen honestly enough, we will find one of the most complete and most ancient records of what it means for a human community to belong to a place, to know a place so thoroughly that the knowledge of it survives even after the place itself has gone beneath the water. That is worth looking for. That is worth the investment, the patience, the time, and the fundamental respect for the communities that have kept the knowledge alive. The coast is still telling its story. The question is whether the rest of the world is finally ready to hear it. Some researchers have begun to argue that the Australian coastal story is not just an Australian story. It is a story about what human knowledge systems are capable of, about the mechanisms by which communities maintain and transmit complex environmental knowledge across deep time, about the relationship between oral tradition and ecological observation, and about what it means for a community to have a genuinely long-term relationship with a landscape. Those questions are relevant far beyond Australia. They are relevant anywhere that human communities are facing rapid environmental change and need to understand their landscape's history in order to navigate their future. They are relevant to the science of oral tradition, to the anthropology of knowledge, to the history of human cognition, and to the political question of whose knowledge counts when important decisions about land and sea are being made. Aboriginal Australians have been making decisions about their coastal country for 50,000 years. They have been adjusting to sea level rise, to species shifts, to climate variation, to all the changes that a dynamic coastal environment produces for longer than any other documented human communities. The record of those adjustments, encoded in the oral traditions and the material culture that has survived, is a resource for understanding how communities can manage long-term environmental change in ways that are sustainable and that maintain the intergenerational transmission of relevant knowledge. It is, in short, one of the most important datasets in the world for understanding human ecological resilience. The failure to recognize it as such, the failure to invest in understanding it properly, the failure to develop the research relationships that would allow the full depth of that knowledge to be documented and understood, is not just a failure of archaeology or anthropology. It is a failure of judgment about what matters, about what kinds of knowledge deserve serious attention, and about which communities' ways of knowing are treated as valid sources of information about the world. That failure is being partially corrected. The pace of correction is slower than the urgency of the questions warrants, but the direction is right. And the coast, drowned and living both, is patient. It has been waiting for 50,000 years already. It can wait a little longer for the investigation it deserves. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. Not stranger in the sense of inexplicable, but stranger in the sense of richer, deeper, older, and more connected to the rest of the human story than anything in the standard account suggested. The Australian coast is the beginning of a story that the world is only now learning to read. And if we are willing to do the work of reading it in full and in partnership with the communities whose story it is, what we will find there will change how we understand ourselves. That is what the deeper investigation of Australia's coast is really about. Not about anomalies and mysteries for their own sake, though the anomalies are real and the mysteries are genuine. Not about overturning conventional archaeology for the sake of drama, though the conventional account is genuinely inadequate and does genuinely need to be revised. It is about taking seriously the possibility that a 50,000-year-old coastal tradition, maintained through catastrophic environmental change and equally catastrophic colonial violence, still has something to teach the rest of the world about what it means to belong to a place and to carry the knowledge of that place across time. The coast remembers. The deeper we dig, the more clearly we can hear what it is remembering. And what it is remembering is one of the oldest, richest, and most extraordinary chapters in the human story. A chapter that is still being written by the communities whose ancestors began it 50,000 years ago, standing at the edge of an ocean they were about to cross, carrying everything they knew into the unknown. The water rose and took the land, but the people kept the knowledge. And the knowledge is still here, still speaking, still waiting to be heard in full. The deeper we dig into Australia's coast, the stranger and the richer it gets. And the work of understanding it is only just beginning. Let us go back to the water. Let us start again at the edge of the continent and work our way around it more carefully. because there are specific places and specific findings that the broader overview has touched on, but not examined in the detail they deserve. The western coast of Australia begins, for our purposes, at the Northwest Cape, the peninsula that juts into the Indian Ocean south of the Exmouth Gulf, where the town of Exmouth now sits and where the United States Navy once operated one of its most powerful submarine communication stations, transmitting to submarines across the Pacific. The Northwest Cape is the closest point of the Australian mainland to the open Indian Ocean, and it sits at the southern end of the Ningaloo Reef, one of the most significant fringing reef systems in the world, and the only large fringing reef on the western coast of a continent. The reef extends south from the Cape for nearly 300 kilometers, running close to the shore in a way that is unusual for fringing reefs of this scale, and it provides one of the most accessible and diverse marine environments anywhere on the Australian coast. Aboriginal occupation of the Northwest Cape region extends back to the oldest layers of the archaeological record for this area, which places people here for at least 30,000 years and possibly significantly longer. The Gnuli people are the traditional custodians of Ningaloo country, and their relationship to the reef and to the ocean it fronts is one of the oldest documented relationships between an Aboriginal community and a specific marine environment. The cultural heritage of the Gnuli in the Ningaloo region has been acknowledged in the naming of the Ningaloo Marine Park and in the UNESCO World Heritage inscription that Ningaloo received in 2011, though the primary basis for that inscription was the outstanding natural value of the reef rather than the cultural heritage of the people who had been managing it for 30,000 years. The Ningaloo Reef, like all of Australia's coastal reef systems, had a very different character during the glacial maximum. The sea level was lower, the reef was more exposed, and the coastal plain that now sits under the shallow waters between the reef and the Cape was dry land. People were living on that plain, fishing from the edge of the reef, harvesting the marine resources of the Indian Ocean from a coastline that was significantly further out than the modern shore. The specific character of the Gnuli relationship to the Ningaloo environment during the period when the coast was different has not been systematically investigated, but the oral traditions of the Gnuli and related groups in the region contain knowledge of the marine environment that is detailed and ecologically precise in ways that suggest very long observation. The ecology of the Ningaloo Reef is one of the most complex on the Australian coast. The reef system includes environments ranging from shallow lagoon and back reef to deep wall and open ocean, and it supports populations of whale sharks, of manta rays, of dugongs, of sea turtles, of hundreds of species of fish, and of the full range of coral species associated with the Indian Ocean. The behavior of whale sharks at Ningaloo, which aggregate in large numbers to feed on coral spawn events, was known to Aboriginal communities long before it became the basis for a significant ecotourism industry. The Gnuli knowledge of the timing and character of the whale shark aggregation, like Aboriginal knowledge of ecological events in other parts of Australia, was not accidental or vague. It was precise. It was embedded in the ceremonial calendar that organized Gnuli life, and it encoded the kind of detailed observation of animal behavior and oceanographic conditions that takes generations of sustained attention to develop. Moving south from Ningaloo, the coast of Western Australia transitions through a series of distinctive environments. The Gascoyne region, centered on Carnarvon, where the Gascoyne River meets the Indian Ocean, has a coastal ecology shaped by the interaction of the southward-flowing Leeuwin Current, one of the longest southward-flowing boundary currents in the world, and the upwelling systems of the eastern Indian Ocean. The Leeuwin Current carries warm water from the tropical north along the Western Australian coast, creating an unusual oceanographic environment in which tropical species are found at latitudes where they would not normally occur. Aboriginal communities along the Gascoyne coast had deep knowledge of this oceanographic system, embedded in the understanding of seasonal patterns and species availability that guided their coastal economy. The Shark Bay region, further south, is one of the most significant marine environments in Australia and was the site of the first documented European landing in Australia When the Dutch navigator Dirk Hartog dropped anchor there in 1616 and left an inscribed pewter plate on the shore. The plate, recently recovered and displayed in a Western Australian museum, is the earliest physical artifact of European contact with the Australian continent. But Aboriginal people had been at Shark Bay for tens of thousands of years before Hartog arrived, and the environments that Hartog observed, the vast seagrass meadows, the stromatolites that represent some of the earliest forms of life on Earth, the extraordinary diversity of marine species, were all shaped partly by the long presence of Aboriginal management of the surrounding coastal landscape. The stromatolites of Hamelin Pool in Shark Bay are one of the most remarkable living natural features in Australia. They are communities of cyanobacteria, the simplest photosynthetic organisms that build mounded structures from carbonate sediment in a process that has been occurring for more than 3 billion years. The Hamelin Pool stromatolites are among the best preserved and most extensive living stromatolite communities anywhere in the world, and they grow in water so saline that the grazing organisms that would normally destroy them cannot survive. The hypersaline conditions that protect the stromatolites are partly the result of the geography of Hamelin Pool and partly the result of the seagrass meadows that line the pool and prevent the more saline water from mixing freely with the open bay. Aboriginal communities knew about the stromatolites, though they did not classify them in the way Western science does. They were part of country, part of the specific character of the Shark Bay coast, part of the knowledge of the place that Gunuli and related communities maintained. The significance of the stromatolites as living representatives of the earliest forms of life, which makes them extraordinary from a scientific perspective, was understood differently within Aboriginal traditional knowledge, but the attention to them, the knowledge of where they were and what conditions they required, was part of the detailed coastal knowledge of the region. The seagrass meadows of Shark Bay are an even more significant coastal feature from the perspective of the human history of the region. Shark Bay contains the largest seagrass meadows in the world, approximately 4,000 square kilometers of seagrass habitat that supports one of the largest dugong populations remaining anywhere in the Indian Ocean region. Dugongs are the marine mammals closest in ecological niche to the ancient Sirenians, the manatees and their relatives, and they are animals of enormous cultural significance to Aboriginal communities throughout coastal, northern and western Australia. The dugong populations of Shark Bay were managed by Aboriginal communities for thousands of years in ways that maintained their abundance, and the specific practices of that management, the seasonal restrictions on hunting, the protection of cows with calves, the avoidance of specific areas during breeding periods were embedded in the traditional law that governed the relationship between people and country. The decline of dugong populations throughout much of their former range, driven by habitat loss, hunting pressure in the historical period, and bycatch in fishing operations, represents one of the most significant ecological losses associated with the disruption of Aboriginal coastal management systems. In the areas where Aboriginal communities have been able to maintain their traditional relationship to dugong country, including parts of Shark Bay and the northern Australian coast, dugong populations have fared better than in areas where that relationship was completely disrupted. This is not coincidence. It reflects the fact that the management practices embedded in traditional law were ecologically effective, developed through thousands of years of observation and adjustment in ways that produced genuinely sustainable outcomes. The dugong is one of the clearest examples of an animal whose current conservation status reflects the failure of the colonial period to maintain the indigenous management systems that had previously kept its population stable. It is also an example of an animal whose relationship to Aboriginal communities is not primarily economic. The dugong is a totemic animal for many coastal communities, an animal whose significance extends beyond its nutritional value to its role in the spiritual and ceremonial life of the communities that regard it as part of their identity. The disruption of that relationship, through colonial violence and the destruction of the traditional management systems, was not simply an ecological disruption. It was a spiritual and cultural one as well. Moving into the southern portion of Western Australia, the coast changes character dramatically. The south coast of WA is one of the most exposed and challenging coastlines on Earth, facing the full force of the Southern Ocean without the barrier of offshore islands or reef systems that protect other stretches of the Australian coast. The Great Australian Bight is the most dramatic feature of this coast, a 1,000-kilometre-long cliff line where the Nullarbor Plain simply stops at the edge of the ocean, dropping straight into the Southern Ocean in walls of limestone that rise as much as 80 metres above the water. The Bight is one of the most spectacular geological features in Australia and one of the least visited because access is extremely difficult and the nearest settlements are remote. The Aboriginal communities whose traditional country included the Bight Coast and the Nullarbor behind it maintain knowledge of this environment across vast distances and timescales. The Nullarbor is not the empty, lifeless plain of popular imagination. It is a landscape with reliable water sources at specific points, with specific animal populations that could be hunted and plant resources that could be gathered at specific seasons, and with a sacred geography that encoded the relationships between places and between the people who moved across them. The people who knew the Nullarbor in the traditional period were not simply traversing an empty landscape. They were moving through a known and named world, every feature of which was part of a system of knowledge and obligation. The caves of the Nullarbor, which penetrate the limestone plateau in a network that has been partially explored by cavers and is substantially more extensive than what has been documented, are features of enormous potential significance for the archaeological record of the Bight Coast and the Nullarbor itself. Cave systems preserve organic material and sediment sequences in conditions that surface environments do not, and some of the caves that have been explored in the Nullarbor contain evidence of Pleistocene fauna, in at least some cases, evidence of human presence extending to the late Pleistocene. The full extent of the cave system and the full extent of its archaeological significance have not been characterized. The resources required for systematic speleological and archaeological survey of the Nullarbor cave system are not available within current research frameworks. Further east along the south coast, moving through the Eyre Peninsula and the Spencer Gulf region into South Australia, the coastal character changes again. The Spencer Gulf and the Gulf of St. Vincent, the two large embayments that define the Yorke Peninsula and the Eyre Peninsula, were during low sea level periods either dry land or very different kinds of water bodies than they are today. The Spencer Gulf is relatively shallow, and during the glacial maximum, much of its floor was exposed. The estuarine and coastal environments that developed at the margins of those ancient water bodies would have been productive and attractive to human communities, and the communities of the Eyre Peninsula and the Yorke Peninsula region, whose traditional custodians are the Wirangu, the Nawu, and other Kokatha groups on the west, and the Narunga on the Yorke Peninsula, maintain knowledge of those coastal environments across the period of sea level change. The Naracoorte Caves, in the southeast of South Australia, are not coastal caves in the modern geography, but they are coastal in the relevant prehistoric geography. During the glacial maximum, the coast of southeastern South Australia was significantly further south, and the area around Naracoorte was closer to the coastal margin than it is today. The caves are famous for their fossil deposits, which include extraordinary collections of Pleistocene megafauna. The UNESCO recognition of the Australian fossil mammal sites, which includes Naracoorte as well as Riverslea in Queensland, reflects the scientific significance of the fossil record there. What has received less attention in the public discussion of Naracoorte is the question of the relationship between the fossil deposits and the period of human occupation, and what that relationship tells us about the ecological context of the first Australians in the southeast. The megafauna extinctions in the southeast of Australia were not a single event, but a process extended over thousands of years, and the specific timing and character of the extinctions varied by species and by region. In the Naracoorte region, some megafauna species persisted for thousands of years after the first humans arrived, while others disappeared earlier. The cave deposits preserve a record of this process with extraordinary resolution, and the analysis of that record in relationship to the evidence for human activity in the region is a research question that is still being worked through. Moving north along the South Australian coast and into Victoria, the region around Portland and the western Victorian coastline where the Budgebim cultural landscape is located deserves extended attention because it represents one of the clearest documented examples of sophisticated pre-contact resource management in the coastal and near-coastal zone. The Gunditjmara people, whose traditional country encompasses the Budgebim area, are recognized as the creators and managers of the Budgebim aquaculture system, and the Budgebim cultural landscape is now one of the most intensively studied examples of pre-contact Aboriginal land use in Australia. What has emerged from the research at Budgebim, conducted in partnership with the Gunditjmara Land Council, and drawing on Gunditjmara traditional knowledge as well as archaeological investigation, is a picture of aquaculture management that was both technically sophisticated and ecologically precise. The eel traps and channels of the Budgebim system were not simple barriers or weirs. They were a carefully designed network of water management infrastructure that used the volcanic landscape of the Lake Condah area to create conditions specifically favorable to the short-finned eel, the species around which the Gunditjmara economy was centered. The short-finned eel is a remarkable animal. It lives in fresh water for most of its life, growing slowly over decades, sometimes reaching ages of more than 50 years. It then migrates to the ocean to breed, a journey from which it does not return. The adult eels that the Gunditjmara harvested were animals that had grown in the Lake Condah system for decades, and they represented an enormous concentration of nutrition that could be dried and stored in ways that supported a population density well beyond what would be possible from purely mobile hunting and gathering. The Budgebim system was essentially a protein bank, a managed production environment that generated reliable surplus that could support permanent settlement and the social complexity that permanent settlement enables. The stone houses associated with the Budgebim system, the most permanent form of built structure in the pre-contact archaeological record in this part of Australia, are evidence that the Gunditjmara were investing in infrastructure in a way that reflects long-term relationship to a specific place. Building a stone house is not the action of a community that expects to move on next season. It is the action of a community that expects to be in the same place for generations, that has structured its economy around resources reliable enough to justify permanent settlement, and that has developed the social institutions necessary to manage a settled community over time. The Gunditjmara case raises the question of how representative it is. Is the Budgebim system exceptional, a unique development in a particularly favorable ecological setting? Or is it representative of a broader pattern of intensive resource management and settlement that existed along the coastal and near-coastal zones of Australia, but that has not been as well documented elsewhere? The evidence suggests that it is not entirely unique. The fish trap systems of coastal New South Wales, the aquaculture traditions of the Murray River communities, the management of marine resources along the northern coast, all suggest that intensive resource management that supported denser populations and more settled lifestyles was more widespread than the simple mobile hunter-gatherer characterization implies. The question is one of visibility. The Budgebim system is visible because the infrastructure is built from stone in a volcanic landscape that preserves stone features exceptionally well, and because the Gunditjmara community has been actively engaged in researching and asserting the significance of their heritage in ways that have attracted academic attention and eventually UNESCO recognition. Other systems, built from less durable materials in less favorable preservation conditions, or maintained by communities that have not had the same access to resources for heritage advocacy, may have existed across a much wider area without leaving the kind of record that draws research attention. This is the fundamental problem with the archaeology of coastal resource management in Australia. The systems that survive are the systems that were built from stone, or that were built in places with exceptionally good preservation conditions, or that have been studied because the communities who own them have been able to advocate for their study. Everything else is inference, and the inference is necessarily limited by the quality of the evidence. The drowned coastal archaeology, where the densest populations would have been, is almost entirely absent from the record. The oral traditions that encode knowledge of those denser coastal communities have been partially disrupted and have not been systematically examined. The result is a picture that underrepresents complexity and settlement density in ways that are significant, and that ongoing research is only slowly correcting. The New South Wales coast offers several specific locations, where the evidence for pre-contact coastal complexity is stronger than average, and where the record of what has been lost is correspondingly poignant. The Sydney region, now the site of Australia's largest city, was before the colonial period one of the most densely populated areas in the southeastern part of the continent. The Eora people, the collective name given to the many language groups and clans of the Sydney Basin coastal country, lived at the margin of one of the most productive estuarine environments in southeastern Australia. The harbour of Port Jackson, now Sydney Harbour, was then a rich estuary full of fish, of shellfish, of waterfowl, of marine mammals, and surrounded by sandstone country with rich coastal heath vegetation that supported a wide range of plant foods and terrestrial animals. The rock engravings that survive in sandstone outcroppings throughout the Greater Sydney region are among the most significant bodies of coastal rock art in southeastern Australia. They depict the animals of the coastal environment: fish, whales, dolphins, stingrays, eels, birds, macropods, human figures, and ancestral beings. They were made by people who knew this coast intimately, who observed its animal life with the attention that comes from depending on it for sustenance, and who encoded that observation in a visual tradition of great sophistication. The engravings are made by abrading the sandstone surface rather than by painting, a technique that produces images of remarkable durability in the erosion-resistant sandstone of the Sydney Basin. The coastal communities of the Sydney region were devastated by the smallpox epidemic that preceded and accompanied the earliest period of European settlement. The epidemic of 1789, which struck the Aboriginal population of the Sydney region within about a year of the first permanent European settlement, killed somewhere between half and three-quarters of the Aboriginal population of the area. The communities that survived were then subject to dispossession, violence, and the full range of colonial policies that disrupted the transmission of knowledge and the continuity of community life. By the time systematic anthropological observation of the Sydney region Aboriginal communities began in the late 19th century, the communities were already dramatically reduced from their pre-contact character, and much of the knowledge of the coast and its management had already been lost. What was lost in the Sydney region in the colonial period was the knowledge of a coastal economy that had been developing for tens of thousands of years. The harbour, the estuaries, the offshore waters, the sandstone country behind the coast, all of it had been managed and known in ways that supported a dense and sedentary population. The middens of the Sydney region, the heaped shell deposits that mark long occupation of specific coastal locations, extend in some cases across millennia of continuous occupation and represent one of the most detailed records of long-term coastal resource use in southeastern Australia. But the communities that created those middens and the knowledge they carried are gone, leaving only the shells and the engravings and the oral traditions that survived the colonial catastrophe in fragmented form. The question that haunts the Sydney region is also the question that haunts the rest of the Australian coast. What did the people who built the middens and made the engravings know about the coast and the sea that we do not yet know? The depth of the Sydney Basin occupation, extending back to the earliest periods of Australian prehistory in the inland caves and rock shelters of the basin, and extending to the coast in ways that the midden record documents, suggests a long and sophisticated engagement with this specific coastal environment. The specific knowledge that engagement produced, the knowledge of tidal patterns and fish behavior, and shellfish ecology, and seasonal variation in marine resources, that knowledge was specific to this place and specific to the people who lived here for thousands of generations. It is largely gone. The coast is still here, still producing the same fish and shellfish and marine mammals it always did, but the people who understood it most completely are not, and neither is the knowledge they carried. The northern coast of New South Wales and the coastal areas of Queensland offer further examples of the pattern. The Aboriginal communities of the northern New South Wales coast, the Gumbayngur, the Yagal, the Bundjalung, the Githabul, and many others, lived in some of the most productive coastal environments in southeastern Australia, where the subtropical climate and the rich river systems created environments of exceptional biological abundance. The Clarence River, the Hastings River, the Mackley River, the Bellinger River, all of these major north coast waterways were surrounded by communities that exploited their coastal and estuarine resources with great sophistication, using fish traps in the estuaries and rivers, harvesting the rich shellfish beds of the estuarine margins, and taking advantage of the seasonal movements of fish species that use the estuaries as nursery habitat. The oyster beds of the northern New South Wales coast were among the most productive shellfish environments in Australia before the colonial period. Aboriginal communities had managed those beds for thousands of years, harvesting in ways that maintained the productivity of the beds across generations. When European settlers arrived and began unrestricted commercial harvesting of the oyster beds, the beds were destroyed within a few decades. The same beds that had fed Aboriginal communities for thousands of years were exhausted within the lifetime of the first generation of European settlers in the region. The contrast between the sustainability of the traditional management and the speed of the colonial destruction is stark and instructive. The loss of the oyster beds is a specific and documented example of a broader pattern that operated all along the Australian coast. The Aboriginal management of coastal resources was not simply the absence of exploitation. It was active management, based on detailed ecological knowledge and embedded in social and ceremonial obligations that distributed harvesting effort and prevented any individual or group from overexploiting a particular resource. When that management was disrupted by colonial violence and dispossession, the resources declined rapidly because the management that had maintained them was gone. The colonial economy did not replace the Aboriginal management with any equivalent system. It simply harvested without limit until the resources were gone. The northern coast of Australia, the coast of Queensland, from Cape York south to the Whitsundays and beyond, is the site of the Great Barrier Reef and the communities that lived along it. The reef communities of Queensland in the pre-contact period are among the most complex and economically sophisticated Aboriginal communities in the archaeological and ethnographic record of Australia. The communities of Cape York Peninsula in particular, living at the northern tip of the continent closest to the Torres Strait and the island chain beyond, maintained economic and cultural relationships that extended north through the strait and into the Melanesian world, and that incorporated maritime technology and knowledge appropriate to a genuinely oceanic environment. The stone fish traps of the Cape York coast, some of which are visible at low tide as extensive arrangements of stones in intertidal and shallow subtidal areas, represent one of the most significant but least studied bodies of coastal infrastructure in Australia. These traps, built from the local stone and designed to take advantage of tidal flow patterns specific to individual locations, represent investments of communal labour that reflect long-term community planning and a detailed understanding of the local tidal and marine ecology. The traps that survive above sea level are almost certainly a small fraction of the total system that existed in the pre-contact period, because many would have been built on ground that is now below the current tidal margin or underwater. The Aboriginal communities of the reef coast knew the reef in ways that are only now beginning to be documented and valued by marine ecologists. Their knowledge of the behavior of specific reef species, of the seasonal patterns of marine life on the reef, of the relationship between lunar cycles and fish behavior, of the specific locations that were most productive for particular species at particular times of year, was embedded in the traditional knowledge systems of reef country and encoded in the ceremonial and oral traditions of the communities that maintained it. This knowledge is not simply folk knowledge in the sense of informal observation. It is the product of systematic observation over thousands of years, embedded in social institutions that enforced accuracy and that transmitted the knowledge with the same precision that the southern sea level traditions were transmitted. The documentation of this traditional ecological knowledge in relation to the Great Barrier Reef has been increasing in recent years. partly in response to the recognition by marine scientists that understanding the historical baseline of reef ecology, what the reef was like before the rapid changes of the 20th century, requires sources beyond the short-term scientific record. Aboriginal traditional knowledge offers exactly that historical baseline, extending the ecological record back thousands of years to periods before commercial fishing, before agricultural runoff, before the temperature changes of recent decades altered the thermal regime of the reef. What the traditional ecological knowledge of reef communities documents, where it has been systematically collected and analyzed, is a reef that was more productive, more abundant, and more diverse than the reef of the recent scientific record. Species that are now rare or absent from parts of the reef were present and abundant within the traditional knowledge period. Reef features that have been degraded in recent decades were intact and functional. The traditional knowledge, in other words, provides evidence of what the reef was and gives some indication of what it could be again if the pressures on it were reduced. This is one of the most direct and practical applications of traditional ecological knowledge to current environmental management, using the deep time observation record embedded in oral traditions to establish what the reef and other coastal environments were like before the rapid changes of the modern period, and to provide targets for conservation and restoration that go beyond the limited baseline of the scientific record. It is a use of traditional knowledge that is growing in recognition and application, though the pace of its incorporation into management frameworks is still slower than the urgency of the reef's current situation warrants. The Torres Strait itself, the narrow body of water separating the tip of Cape York from the island of New Guinea, is one of the most significant points in the human geography of Australia and the Pacific. It is where Australia and New Guinea were connected in the period before the sea level rise, and it is where, after the connection was severed, the maritime cultures of the two separated landmasses continued to maintain contact across the open water. The Torres Strait Islander people, who live on the islands of the strait and whose traditional country encompasses the waters between, are among the most explicitly maritime communities in Australia, maintaining traditions of ocean navigation, of inter-island travel, and of marine resource management that reflect thousands of years of life in an ocean environment. The Torres Strait Islanders speak languages of two distinct language families, reflecting the complex history of the strait and the diverse cultural heritage of its communities. The Eastern Islands speak languages related to the Papuan languages of New Guinea. The Western Islands speak languages related to the Aboriginal languages of Cape York Peninsula. The Central Islands are linguistically and culturally complex, reflecting the mixing of different traditions in a region that has been a meeting point for centuries. This linguistic and cultural diversity is itself evidence of the long history of the Strait as a zone of interaction between the Aboriginal traditions of Australia and the Melanesian traditions of New Guinea and the island chains to the north. The maritime traditions of the Torres Strait Islanders include knowledge of ocean navigation using stellar orientation, wave patterns, and wind direction that reflects the deep maritime heritage of the Pacific. The double outrigger canoes that were traditionally used in the strait, and the larger sailing canoes used for inter-island and inter-community travel, represent a tradition of watercraft construction and ocean navigation that extends back into the period before the current islands were islands, into the time when the landscape of the strait was a coastal plain, and the communities of what is now the Australian mainland and what is now New Guinea were not separated by water. The rising sea level that created the Torres Strait did not simply create a geographical barrier. It created a maritime culture in the communities that remained on the elevated ground that became the islands, that was shaped by the challenge and the opportunity of living between two larger landmasses, managing relationships with communities on both sides, and developing the maritime technology and knowledge necessary to do so. The Torres Strait Islanders are, in this sense, the inheritors of a cultural adaptation to sea level rise that is specific to their location, a maritime culture born from the flooding of the land connection and maintained and developed across the thousands of years since. This makes the current situation of the Torres Strait Islanders, facing a new sea level rise that threatens the islands their ancestors chose or were confined to by the last sea level rise, one of the most historically resonant environmental situations anywhere on Earth. The communities that carry 10,000-year-old oral traditions describing the flooding of the previous coastal landscape are now watching the process repeat. The knowledge they carry is not simply historical. It is immediately relevant to their current situation and to the decisions their communities need to make about the future. Whether the communities of the Torres Strait will be able to remain on their islands, or whether rising seas will force relocation of the kind that their ancestors experienced when the last sea level rise separated the islands from the mainland, is a question that is not yet resolved. What is clear is that the communities themselves are engaged with this question in a way that is informed by both their traditional knowledge and their engagement with current science, and that their perspective on the situation, rooted in thousands of years of living with the specific marine and coastal environment of the strait, is one that deserves serious attention in the broader conversation about climate adaptation. The Australian coast, from the northwestern shores of the Kimberley to the western Victorian coast to the northeast Queensland Reef to the Torres Strait, is not a single story. It is many stories, each specific to its own ecological and cultural context, each reflecting the specific history of the communities that belong to that particular stretch of coast. What those stories share is the depth of their time, the scale of what was lost when the sea rose and when the colonial period disrupted the communities that carried the knowledge, and the significance of what has survived. The investigation of those stories, the archaeological work, the documentation of oral traditions, the engagement with traditional ecological knowledge, the development of underwater survey capacity, the building of research relationships with Aboriginal communities, all of this is work that has been begun but not completed. The urgency of completing it is driven partly by the genuine scientific value of the knowledge that might be recovered, partly by the rapid changes in the marine and coastal environment that are making the historical baseline encoded in traditional knowledge more valuable with each passing year, and partly by the pace at which the communities that carry that knowledge are aging, and the transmission of their knowledge to younger generations is complicated by all the forces that complicate the maintenance of traditional knowledge in the contemporary world. The coast is old, the knowledge is old, the questions are urgent, and the work of answering them, of digging deeper into the story of Australia's coast, is work that the world owes to the people who kept that story alive through everything that tried to end it. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more clearly we can see the outline of something extraordinary, something that the standard account has never adequately captured. The full weight and depth of the oldest coastal culture on Earth. There is a particular quality to the light on the Australian coast at the moment before dawn. Anyone who has stood on a beach in the Kimberley or on the Queensland coast or along the Great Australian Bight in that specific hour when the sky begins to separate itself from the water, the deep indigo pulling back from black, the first colour arriving not as warmth but as the faintest edge of recognition, knows what that quality is without being able to name it. The coast teaches you things about time that no inland landscape teaches in quite the same way. The ocean marks time differently. The tides, rising and falling twice a day, give you a different kind of clock. The seasons, visible in the behavior of animals and in the patterns of weather and current, give you a different kind of year. The reef, growing at millimeters per year toward a surface it has been tracking for thousands of years, gives you a different kind of century. People who have lived on a specific stretch of coast for 50,000 years have been taught by that coast in ways that go very deep. Their perception of time, of change, of what is significant and what is noise has been shaped by the specific rhythms of the specific coast they belong to. The knowledge that results from this is not only ecological, not only practical, it is perceptual. It is a way of being in the world that is inseparable from the specific relationship to a specific place. This is why the loss of coastal Aboriginal cultures is not only a loss of information, a loss of data that could in principle be reconstructed by other means. It is a loss of ways of perceiving the coast, ways of being present to it, ways of knowing it that are not reducible to the propositional content of any oral tradition or any body of traditional ecological knowledge. The traditions and the knowledge can be partially recovered, but the perceptual world from which they emerged, the experience of being a person who belongs to that coast and who has been shaped by it across a lifetime in the way that people belonging to that coast were shaped across lifetimes, that is not recoverable from the outside. It can only be lived, and it can only be lived if the relationship between community and coast is maintained intact across generations. This is the deepest reason why the survival and flourishing of coastal Aboriginal communities is not simply a matter of justice, though it is certainly that. It is also a matter of knowledge. The communities that belong to the Australian coast are the custodians of the deepest understanding of that coast that exists anywhere. Not understanding in the sense of data or propositions that could be extracted and stored elsewhere, but understanding in the sense of a living relationship to a living place that exists only in the community and cannot be separated from it without being destroyed. The conservation of that understanding requires the conservation of the conditions that make it possible. Secure connection to country, the legal and material ability to maintain traditional management practices, the social conditions for the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, the recognition by wider Australian society and by government policy of the validity and significance of traditional knowledge as knowledge, not as ethnographic curiosity. These are political questions as much as research questions, and they are questions that the research community working on Australian coastal prehistory has an interest in, because the research cannot fully succeed without the communities, and the communities cannot fully thrive without the conditions that support the knowledge the research is trying to understand. The political dimension of Australian coastal research is not something that can be set aside as irrelevant to the science. The research and the politics are entangled. In the specific history of how Aboriginal cultural heritage has been treated by the Australian state, in the ongoing struggles of coastal communities for recognition of their rights and their knowledge, and in the structural features of the research funding system that determine what gets studied and by whom and with what relationships to the communities whose heritage is being investigated. The Native Title Act of 1993, which recognised for the first time in Australian law the possibility that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples might retain traditional rights to land under Australian law, was a watershed moment for coastal communities. For the first time, the connection between community and country that Aboriginal people had maintained throughout the colonial period, in the face of explicit government policy designed to destroy it, was recognised as legally significant. The subsequent decades of native title determination have produced outcomes that vary widely in their acknowledgement of coastal rights, and the process of native title determination has been criticised for its cost, its complexity, and the extent to which it requires Aboriginal communities to prove their connection to country in terms defined by non-Aboriginal law rather than their own institutions. But the recognition of native title, however imperfect, has been significant for the ability of coastal communities to maintain their relationship to their coastal country and to engage in the management of coastal resources in ways that reflect traditional knowledge. The intersection of native title and marine resource management is one of the most complex and practically significant areas in which the legal recognition of Aboriginal rights to coastal country is playing out. The marine areas adjacent to coast where native title has been determined are increasingly the subject of management arrangements that involve traditional owners as co-managers or as managers with authority to apply traditional knowledge in the management of specific marine resources. The Sea Country Native Title Determinations, which recognise traditional owner rights to specific areas of sea, are a relatively recent development in Australian native title law and one that is growing in extent and significance. For the research community, the development of native title and sea country determinations over the past 3 decades has created new opportunities and new obligations. The communities that have secure recognition of their connection to coastal country are in a better position to engage with research proposals on their own terms, to define the conditions under which research occurs, and to ensure that the benefits of research flow back to the community rather than exclusively to academic institutions. The communities that are still in the process of asserting or defending their connection to country are in a more difficult position, facing the double challenge of the research engagement on top of the legal and political struggle for recognition. The most productive research on Australian coastal prehistory is happening at the intersection of these different forces, where communities with secure connections to country and the resources to engage with researchers are partnering with researchers who have the methodological expertise and the resources to conduct the archaeological and archival investigation that neither community nor researchers could accomplish alone. These partnerships are not always easy. The history of the relationship between Aboriginal communities and researchers creates a background of mistrust that takes time to overcome. The different institutional logics of community governance and academic research create friction around timelines, intellectual property, publication, and the definition of success. But where they work in ways that produce knowledge that neither side could have produced alone. The Buj Bim Research Partnership, the Majid Bebe excavations conducted in partnership with the Mirarr people and the Gunjay Himi Aboriginal Corporation, the Murujuga Rock Art Documentation Project involving the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation. These are examples of what coastal research can look like when it is done with genuine respect for community governance and genuine commitment to shared benefit. They are not perfect examples, and the communities involved would be the first to identify the ways in which even the best research relationships fall short of ideal. But they represent a direction, and that direction is toward more knowledge, more rigorously obtained, more equitably shared. The underwater dimension of Australian coastal research, the investigation of the drowned continental shelf, is the frontier where the methodological and partnership challenges are most acute and where the potential rewards are greatest. The development of underwater archaeological survey capability at the scale required to investigate the Australian shelf is not a near-term prospect with current resources. It requires investment in vessels, in remotely operated vehicle technology, in the sonar and imaging systems needed to identify potential sites from surveys, and in the diving and underwater excavation capability needed to investigate specific locations once they are identified. It also requires the development of the legal and ethical frameworks within which underwater investigation of Aboriginal cultural heritage can proceed, frameworks that recognize the rights of traditional owners to their submerged country in ways that the current native title framework does not fully address. The submerged cultural heritage of the Australian continental shelf is not currently protected under any specific legal framework. The Historic Shipwrecks Act, which protects underwater cultural heritage of historical significance in Australian waters, was not designed with Aboriginal cultural heritage in mind and does not adequately address the rights of traditional owners to the archaeological remains of their pre-contact coastal occupation. The development of a legal framework that recognizes the significance of submerged Aboriginal cultural heritage and the rights of traditional owners to it is a necessary precondition for the responsible development of underwater archaeological survey programs on the Australian shelf. This is a frontier not just in research terms but in legal, ethical and political terms, and it is a frontier where the international precedents are limited. Other maritime nations are developing their frameworks for the protection of Indigenous cultural heritage in underwater environments. But Australia's specific context, the depth of its coastal Indigenous heritage, the scale of the drowned landscape, and the specific history of the relationship between Aboriginal communities and the state means that international precedents can only partially inform what needs to be developed here. The urgency of developing these frameworks is real, because the threats to the submerged cultural heritage of the Australian shelf are real and growing. Offshore industrial development, including oil and gas extraction, pipeline infrastructure, and offshore wind energy development, involves activities that disturb seafloor sediment in ways that could damage or destroy archaeological sites. Sand extraction for coastal management and construction purposes removes seafloor material without any assessment of its archaeological significance. Commercial fishing activities involving bottom trawling have been shown in other contexts to damage submerged archaeological sites. Climate-driven changes in ocean currents and sediment dynamics are altering the conditions on the continental shelf in ways that could expose or rebury sites. The case for urgency is not speculative. The evidence of sophisticated pre-contact occupation extending into the period when the continental shelf was dry land is real, documented in the oral traditions and in the preliminary underwater investigations that have been conducted. The evidence that those remains exist on the shelf is real, supported by the logic of where people lived and by the handful of specific site finds that have been made. The threats to those remains are real and growing. The framework for protecting them and investigating them responsibly is inadequate. The gap between the significance of the heritage and the adequacy of the protection is one of the largest in the world for submerged archaeological heritage. The Australian government has a specific obligation here, not only as the guardian of the cultural heritage of its citizens, but as the state that bears responsibility for the colonial disruption that destroyed or diminished the communities that would have been the natural custodians of that heritage. The research investment required to investigate the submerged cultural heritage of the Australian shelf is not disproportionate to the significance of what might be found, and it is not disproportionate to the colonial debt that Australia owes to the communities whose heritage is at stake. What is required, ultimately, is a genuine national commitment to understanding the full depth of Australia's coastal history, a commitment that goes beyond the piecemeal and inadequate investment in coastal archaeology that has characterized the past half-century. A commitment that recognizes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional knowledge as a central resource for that understanding, not a supplementary one. A commitment that develops the research partnerships, the legal frameworks, and the underwater investigation capacity that the scale of the question demands. And a commitment that shares the results of that investigation, not as the property of academic institutions or government agencies, but as the common heritage of Australia and of the communities whose ancestors made it. The deeper we dig into Australia's coast, the stranger it gets. The stranger it gets, the more clearly we can see how much we do not know, and how much we stand to learn if we are willing to invest in the learning. The coast is waiting. The communities are waiting. The shelf is waiting. And the knowledge is waiting in the traditions that have survived, in the memories that have been kept, and in the sediment on the ocean floor where the oldest coastal culture on Earth left its mark 50,000 years ago and has been waiting for someone to come and read it ever since. The water is patient. It always has been. And so, in their way, are the people who have kept the memory of what lies beneath it. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the closer we come to understanding what it really means to have lived for 50,000 years on the edge of the sea, watching the world change, remembering what was lost, and keeping the knowledge of it alive for those who would come after. That is the Australian coastal story. It is not finished. It is barely begun. And the beginning of the rest of it, the investigation that has not yet happened, the knowledge that has not yet been recovered, the partnerships that have not yet been built, awaits anyone willing to take it seriously and to do the work it requires. The coast is deep, the story is deeper, and the deeper we dig, the more of it we find. There are specific mysteries along the Australian coast that deserve direct and detailed treatment because they sit at the intersection of what is known, what is suspected, and what remains genuinely open. These are not the mysteries of pseudo-archaeology, not the fabricated anomalies of ancient alien speculation, or the misrepresented findings of sensationalized online content. They are real questions in the academic literature, questions raised by serious researchers on the basis of evidence that has not yet been adequately explained. Gathering them together in one place shows something that the fragmented nature of the research literature tends to obscure. The pattern of unresolved questions along the Australian coast is not random. It reflects a systematic gap between the sophistication of the coastal communities that the evidence suggests and the narrative that the institutional research culture has been willing to endorse. The first of these specific mysteries is the question of the Bradshaw figures of the Kimberley and what tradition they represent. The Gwion figures, which are now the preferred name used by the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional custodians of the country where many of the figures occur, are extraordinary images. They show elongated human figures in elaborate headdresses and clothing, many of them depicted in postures of movement and in what appear to be complex ceremonial or social contexts. They are painted with a technique of considerable skill, using fine lines to render details of clothing and body decoration that have no parallel in other bodies of Australian rock art. And they are old, though exactly how old remains disputed. The dating question is central to the mystery. If the Gwion tradition began 17,000 years ago, as the wasp nest dating has been argued to suggest, then it represents a tradition that began during the last glacial maximum, when the Kimberley was part of a very different coastal landscape. If it began more recently, it still represents a body of figurative art that has no close parallel elsewhere in Australia. The specific character of the figures, their clothing and headdresses and elaborate decoration, suggests a cultural context of considerable complexity, a tradition in which personal ornamentation and ceremonial display were important, and in which the representation of those things in a durable medium was considered worthwhile. The Ngunnawal people, who are the custodians of Gwion country, have their own understanding of the figures and their origin that is embedded in their traditional knowledge. Outside researchers have not had full access to that understanding, for reasons that are entirely appropriate given the history of how Aboriginal cultural heritage has been treated. What the outside research community can say is that the figures represent a tradition of figurative art of great skill and cultural complexity, that the tradition is old enough to be associated with a coastal landscape that no longer exists in its current form, and that the specific content of the tradition has not been adequately explained within the frameworks of mainstream Australian rock art research. The second specific mystery is the question of the Wandjina figures and their iconographic relationships. As noted earlier, the Wandjina figures of the Kimberley have been compared by various researchers and observers to ancient images from cultures separated from Australia by thousands of miles and thousands of years. The mainstream position is that these comparisons reflect convergent iconographic development. The alternative position, held by a minority of researchers, is that the similarities are too specific and too consistent to be explained by convergence alone, and that they may reflect some form of contact or shared heritage that the standard narrative does not accommodate. The specific features that generate the comparison are the large, round head with large eyes and no mouth, the radiating lines around the head interpreted as either a halo or as depicting the energy or power of the figure, the frontal orientation of the face, and the overall impression of a being that is both human and superhuman in character. Similar features appear in some ancient Egyptian representations, in some Mesopotamian figures, and in various traditions from the ancient Near East. The comparison has been made by serious researchers, as well as by popular writers of the ancient alien persuasion, and the fact that the popular versions of the comparison are generally unreliable does not mean the underlying observation is without substance. What would be required to adequately evaluate the comparison is a careful, peer-reviewed analysis of the specific iconographic features of the Wandjina tradition and the proposed comparative traditions, conducted without the a priori assumption that the comparison must be wrong because contact was impossible, and without the a priori assumption that the comparison must be right because anomalies are interesting. That analysis has not been done in the form it needs to be done, partly because the subject is sensitive and partly because the methodological challenges are real. A comparative iconographic analysis of this scope requires expertise in multiple traditions simultaneously, and the researchers with adequate expertise in Kimberley rock art are not typically the same researchers with adequate expertise in ancient Near Eastern iconography. The third specific mystery is the question of genetic evidence for pre-Macassan maritime contact between Australia and populations outside the continent. The 2013 paper by Pugak and colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, found a signal of gene flow into Aboriginal Australians from South Asian populations dated to approximately 4,000 years ago. This is not a finding from fringe research. It is a peer-reviewed result from a major journal. It has been debated and alternative interpretations have been proposed, but it has not been definitively refuted. If it is correct, it implies contact between populations of South Asian origin and Aboriginal Australians 4,000 years ago, a contact that would have occurred before the Macassan period by at least 3,000 years. The mechanisms by which such contact could have occurred are not established. The geography of the Indian Ocean at 4,000 years ago, with sea levels approximately where they are today, makes direct voyaging from South Asia to Australia theoretically possible, but would require ocean-going capability that is not documented for that period in the archaeological record. However, the archaeological record is incomplete in exactly the areas where the relevant voyaging would have occurred. An absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in an ocean where wooden boats would not survive 4,000 years. The South Asian genetic signal in Aboriginal Australians also co-occurs with the appearance in Australia of two things that do not otherwise have an obvious explanation for their Australian presence. The dingo, the wild dog whose ancestors were a form of domestic dog, brought to Australia from somewhere in the Southeast Asian or South Asian region, and the microliths, a specific style of small stone tool that appears in the Australian archaeological record approximately 4,000 years ago and has parallels in South Asian stone tool traditions. The coincidence of three independent lines of evidence, genetic, zoological, and archaeological, all pointing to approximately the same time period and approximately the same source region, is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of a contact event that the standard narrative has not yet incorporated. The dingo is perhaps the clearest and most widely accepted of these three anomalies, because its presence in Australia requires an explanation, and the most parsimonious explanation is human introduction. Dingoes are not native to Australia. Their ancestors were domestic dogs, related to South Asian dog lineages, that arrived in Australia and then underwent a secondary process of going wild, adapting to the Australian environment and spreading across the continent. They spread into every part of Australia except Tasmania, which they never reached, almost certainly because the Bass Strait was too wide a water crossing for them to make unassisted. Their presence in Australia, dating to approximately 3,500 years ago in the oldest dated remains, requires a human vector. Somebody brought a dog or dogs to Australia from somewhere, and that somebody was navigating across open ocean. Who that somebody was, and where they came from, and what their relationship was to the Aboriginal communities they encountered in Australia, are questions that have not been resolved. The genetic analysis of the dingo, which shows its closest relationship to South Asian village dogs, points towards South Asia or island Southeast Asia as the source. But the specific mechanism of introduction, whether it was a deliberate introduction by a trading party, an accidental introduction of a dog that escaped from a vessel, or something else entirely, is not established. The fourth specific mystery is the carved stone heads. This one is more locally specific and more controversial, but it falls within the category of findings that have not been adequately investigated, rather than the category of findings that have been adequately investigated and found to be without archaeological significance. In several locations in coastal and near-coastal Australia, particularly in parts of Queensland, there have been reports of carved stone objects that appear to represent human or human-like heads, with facial features that have been interpreted by some observers as consistent with non-Aboriginal cultural traditions. These reports are not systematic. They come from a variety of sources of varying reliability, and the objects involved have not always been subjected to proper archaeological analysis. The mainstream response to these reports has generally been either dismissal without adequate investigation, or the explanation that the objects are natural formations that the observer has interpreted as artificial. Both responses may sometimes be correct. Natural stone formations can create forms that look artificially carved, and pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive faces in non-face objects, is a well-documented cognitive phenomenon. But dismissal without investigation is not the same as investigation and negative result. The objects reported from coastal Queensland have not been systematically surveyed, documented, and analysed. Some of them may be natural, some may be Aboriginal carvings in a tradition not previously documented, and some, conceivably, may be something else, though the bar for that conclusion would require extraordinarily strong evidence. The point is not that the carved stone heads are evidence of pre-Columbian contact with distant civilizations. The point is that the response to anomalous reports in Australian coastal archaeology has too often been dismissal rather than investigation, and that this response reflects a cultural bias in the research community rather than a neutral evaluation of the evidence. The bias is understandable in historical context. The sensational claims of popular writers about ancient Australian history have been so consistently wrong and so damaging to Aboriginal cultural heritage that researchers have developed a strong prior towards skepticism of anything that sounds anomalous. But that prior needs to be held in tension with the genuine openness to anomaly that is a fundamental scientific virtue, and in the Australian coastal context, it has not always been. The fifth specific mystery is the platform mounds of the North Coast. In several locations along the northern Australian coast, particularly in the Arnhem Land region, researchers have noted the existence of earth or shell mound features that are significantly larger than the typical midden or camping mound, and that are positioned in ways consistent with deliberate construction rather than gradual accumulation. These features have been noted in the literature, but have not been systematically investigated. The analogy with the platform mounds of other world regions, particularly with the mound builder traditions of North America and the raised field systems of Amazonia, suggests that large earth or shell construction might be associated with social complexity and with the need to manage specific resources in ways that require collective labor and long-term planning. In Australia, the assumption has generally been that large mound features are the accumulated result of long-term occupation rather than deliberate construction, and that assumption may often be correct. But the assumption has not always been tested rigorously. Some of the mound features of the northern coast are large enough and regularly shaped enough that the accumulation interpretation requires either very long occupation or very intensive short-term use or some combination. Whether any of them represent deliberate construction for purposes analogous to the platform mounds of other regions is a question that has been raised but not settled. The investigation of these features is complicated by their location in country that is culturally sensitive, by the logistical challenges of working in the Arnhem Land and Kimberley regions, where access requires permits, and where the research season is constrained by weather, and by the general underfunding of research in this area. But the question is legitimate, and the answer, whatever it turns out to be, would be significant for understanding the character of the coastal communities of northern Australia in the periods before and during the sea level rise. The sixth specific mystery is the question of voyaging north. If Aboriginal Australians were capable of maritime activities sufficient to access offshore islands and to maintain relationships across significant stretches of open water, were they also capable of voyaging north from Australia into the island chains of Southeast Asia? The question is not simply whether it was physically possible, though the physical feasibility depends on the state of maritime technology at various periods and is not straightforwardly established. It is also whether there is any evidence that such voyaging occurred. The evidence is indirect and contested, but not non-existent. Some Aboriginal traditions in northern Australia describe journeys to lands to the north, journeys that extend beyond the immediately adjacent islands and into a more distant ocean geography. The interpretation of these traditions is uncertain. They might describe actual voyaging in the historical period, or they might encode knowledge of the geography of the northern sea routes acquired through the Macassan contact, or they might be cosmological rather than geographical in character. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires close reading of the traditions themselves in consultation with the communities that maintain them, and that reading has not been done with the rigor the question deserves. The genetic evidence that shows Denisovan ancestry in Aboriginal Australians, dating to the period before or during the Australian colonisation, implies that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were in contact with Denisovan populations in Southeast Asia before or during their migration to Australia. The specific geography of that contact, and whether it involved voyaging in multiple directions rather than simply migration in one direction, is not established. But the maritime capability implied by the Australian colonisation was sufficient for repeated crossings between island Southeast Asia and the Australian coast, and repeated crossings in one direction create the conditions for crossings in the other direction. None of these 6 specific mysteries is resolved. Each of them represents a genuine gap in the research record, a question raised by evidence that has been collected but not adequately analysed, or by traditions that have been noted but not adequately studied, or by patterns that have been observed but not adequately investigated. Together, they suggest that the Australian coastal record contains more genuine anomaly than the institutional research culture has been comfortable acknowledging, and that the anomalies, properly investigated, would produce findings of significance for understanding human prehistory. The pattern is consistent. Wherever serious researchers have looked carefully at the Australian coastal record, they have found evidence of greater sophistication, greater complexity, and greater connection to the broader human world than the standard narrative had prepared them for. The sea level change research found 10,000-year-old geological memory in oral traditions. The Budge Bim research found aquaculture infrastructure older than the Egyptian pyramids. The genetic research found gene flow from South Asian populations 4,000 years ago. The Majid Bebe excavation found artifacts potentially 65,000 years old. Each of these findings exceeded what the previous consensus had suggested was likely, and each of them was initially met with skepticism and required years of advocacy and additional evidence to gain acceptance. The pattern suggests that the current consensus, whatever it is at any given moment, underestimates the Australian coastal record in ways that new investigation consistently reveals. This is not because researchers are foolish or incompetent. It is because the evidence base is genuinely limited, genuinely fragmentary, and genuinely subject to the sampling biases imposed by the fact that most of it is underwater or has been disrupted by colonialism. Working with a fragmentary and biased sample produces conservative conclusions, and the Australian coastal record is as fragmentary and biased as any record in prehistoric archaeology. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. The pattern says so. Every new investigation finds something that the previous level of investigation had not anticipated. There is no reason to think the next level of investigation will be different. What is needed, ultimately, is the willingness to take the Australian coastal record as seriously as it deserves, to invest in the investigation at the scale and with the methodological rigor that the significance of the questions demands, and to do so in genuine partnership with the communities that are the legitimate custodians of the heritage being investigated. That is a straightforward prescription. Implementing it requires resources, political will, and institutional change of a scale that has not yet materialized. But the case for it is overwhelming, and it grows stronger with every new finding that exceeds what the previous consensus had suggested. The coast is the oldest human coast on Earth. Its secrets are real, its keepers are alive, and the deeper we dig, the more of both we find. The ocean remembers everything that has passed over it and through it and across it for the 50,000 years that human beings have been watching it from the Australian shore. It does not give up those memories easily. The water is opaque, the sediment accumulates, the corals grow, the tides redistribute the evidence of ancient human presence in ways that confuse and conceal. But the ocean is not impenetrable, and the traditions of the people who have watched it for 50,000 years are not lost, not entirely, not yet. The work of understanding Australia's coast in its full depth and complexity is the work of a generation of researchers, in partnership with the communities whose heritage is at stake. With the tools and technologies that are now available or are being developed, and with the willingness to be surprised, to find more than the standard account prepared us for, to revise and expand the story as the evidence demands. That is the work. The coast is waiting for it. And the deeper the dig goes, the stranger it gets, and the richer and the more revealing of who we really are, and how long we have really been keeping the watch at the edge of the sea. There is one final dimension of the Australian coastal story that brings all the others together, and it is the dimension that connects the ancient past to the immediate present in a way that makes the investigation of that past not simply an academic exercise, but an urgent, practical necessity. It is the dimension of ecological baseline, of what the coast looked like and how it functioned before the rapid changes of the modern era, and why that knowledge matters for managing what is happening right now. The Great Barrier Reef is bleaching. The bleaching events of the last decade, the mass mortality events in which elevated ocean temperatures cause the coral to expel the algae that gives it color and nutrition, leaving it white and vulnerable and often dead, represent the most visible and most catastrophic ecological change occurring on the Australian coast in the modern era. The 2016 and 2017 bleaching events, which affected the northern two-thirds of the reef with unprecedented severity, were followed by further bleaching events in subsequent years. The cumulative mortality represents a transformation of the reef ecosystem that has no precedent in the observational scientific record. But the observational scientific record of the Great Barrier Reef extends back only about a century in any systematic form. And in that century, the reef has already been subject to significant human impacts beyond temperature-driven bleaching, including agricultural runoff, coastal development, altered water flows from changed land use, overfishing, and the introduction of invasive species. The reef that scientists began systematically observing in the early 20th century was already different from the reef of the pre-contact period. The historical baseline against which current change is being measured is not the pristine baseline of the pre-contact era. It is the already degraded baseline of the early 20th century. Understanding what the pre-contact reef was like and how it functioned, and what its ecological range and resilience were, requires the kind of historical information that the short-term scientific record cannot provide. It requires the kind of deep-time observation that is encoded in the traditional ecological knowledge of the reef coast communities. And it requires the kind of paleoecological research that can read the historical record of reef ecology from the physical and chemical signatures preserved in coral cores, in sediment sequences, and in the shell middens of the coastal communities that harvested reef resources for tens of thousands of years. The midden sequences of the Queensland coast contain precisely this kind of information. A shell midden represents a long-term record of human exploitation of a specific set of marine species at a specific location. The species composition of the midden, the sizes of individual shells, the age structure of the populations represented, all of these things encode information about the state of the marine ecosystem at the time of collection. By tracking changes in these parameters through a midden sequence that covers thousands of years, researchers can reconstruct the trajectory of marine ecosystem change over deep time, identifying shifts in species composition, population size, and ecological condition that correspond to known events in the climate record, in the history of sea level change, and in the history of human occupation. This kind of paleoecological analysis of Queensland coast middens has been done at some locations, but has not been systematically applied across the full range of midden sequences available. The potential information content of a comprehensive paleoecological analysis of Queensland coast middens, extending from Cape York south to the Glasshouse Mountains and linking to the reef ecology data being gathered by marine scientists, is enormous. It would provide a baseline for understanding reef and coastal ecosystem function that extends thousands of years into the past, transforming the context within which current changes are understood and against which recovery targets are defined. The same logic applies to the fish trap systems of the coast. The stone fish traps of coastal New South Wales and Queensland are not just cultural heritage in the sense of objects that are significant for what they tell us about the past. They are functional structures, built to take advantage of tidal flows and fish behavior patterns that still exist, and in some cases, they can be made functional again. The Aboriginal communities that built and maintained those traps possess detailed knowledge of the fish species that use them, of the seasonal patterns of fish movement, of the specific ecological conditions that made particular trap configurations effective. That knowledge is embodied in the design of the traps themselves, and it is partially encoded in the oral traditions of the communities that built them. Recovering the operational logic of the fish trap systems, in partnership with the communities whose traditions contain that logic, would provide two things simultaneously: a richer understanding of the pre-contact coastal economy and its ecological basis, and a set of practical knowledge that could potentially inform the design of contemporary fisheries management strategies that work with tidal and fish movement dynamics rather than against them. Traditional fishing infrastructure and knowledge systems are being recognized in several parts of the world as sources of practically applicable ecological understanding, and the Australian context is one where this recognition has been particularly slow to develop. The same logic applies to the managed burning of coastal vegetation. Coastal heath, coastal scrub, and the vegetation of estuarine margins along the Australian coast are fire-adapted communities that evolved in the context of regular Aboriginal burning. The fire regimes applied by Aboriginal communities were specific to particular vegetation types and particular seasons, and they produced a mosaic of habitat conditions that supported both the plant species, communities, and the animal populations that Aboriginal coastal economies depended on. When those fire regimes were disrupted by the colonial period, the vegetation changed. The coastal heathlands of southeastern Australia, the Banksia scrubs of the southwestern WA coast, the coastal eucalypt woodlands of various regions, all shifted in their species composition and structure in ways that reflect the changed fire regime. Restoration of something like the traditional fire regimes in coastal areas is a recognized goal of many land and fire management programs in Australia, and the practical knowledge for implementing those regimes, the specific knowledge of when and where and how to burn for particular ecological outcomes, is held by the Aboriginal communities whose ancestors developed it. The collaboration between traditional fire practitioners and contemporary land managers is one of the most productive areas in Australian natural resource management, and it is an area where the coastally specific dimensions of traditional fire knowledge have not been fully explored. The coast concentrates ecological complexity. The margins of land and sea are where the greatest productivity occurs, where the greatest diversity of species interactions takes place, where human communities have historically concentrated because the resources are richest and most accessible. Managing those margins effectively, in the current context of rapid change, requires understanding them in their full ecological depth, including the deep time depth that only traditional knowledge and paleoecological research can provide. And in the Australian context, that deep time ecological depth is associated specifically with the communities that have lived on and managed the coast for 50,000 years. The practical implications of all of this are not complicated, even if implementing them is. They require taking traditional ecological knowledge seriously as a source of ecologically valid information, not as a cultural curiosity or a heritage resource, but as a legitimate knowledge system with things to say about how coastal ecosystems function and how they can be managed. They require investing in the research that recovers and documents that knowledge in forms that can inform contemporary management. They require the legal and policy frameworks that recognize traditional owner rights to coastal country and that support the maintenance of traditional management practices. And they require the humility to acknowledge that 50,000 years of successful coastal management, maintained through catastrophic environmental change, is not something that modern science or modern management practice can simply replace or disregard. The Australian coast is one of the great natural and cultural wonders of the planet. It is the oldest continuously occupied coastline on Earth, and the culture that has maintained the longest relationship with it is one of the most sophisticated and most ancient knowledge systems in human history. That relationship and that knowledge system are under threat from forces that include rapid environmental change, the ongoing consequences of the colonial period, and the specific vulnerability of old knowledge systems to the conditions of the contemporary world. The investigation and the celebration and the protection of the Australian coastal story are not optional extras in the work of understanding and caring for this coast. They are essential to that work. The deeper we dig into Australia's coast, the stranger it gets. The stranger it gets, the richer the story becomes. And the richer the story becomes, the more clearly we can see what it means to have maintained the oldest conversation between human beings and the sea that the world has ever seen, and what we stand to lose if we do not listen to that conversation before it falls silent. Listen. The water is speaking, the stone is speaking, the traditions are speaking, in the languages of the people who belong to this coast, in the images they carved into the rock, and the songs they sang about the stars, and the stories they told about the sea rising, and the land going under, and the knowledge being kept alive through it all. The deeper we dig, the more clearly we can hear all of it. And what we hear, if we listen honestly and carefully, and with the respect that 50,000 years of human presence on this coast demands, is not the story of a simple and isolated people living quietly on an empty continent. What we hear is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the human story, a chapter of great knowledge and great resilience and great loss and great survival, a chapter that is still being written by the communities whose ancestors began it at the edge of an ocean. They were the first human beings to know. That is the Australian coastal story. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the more it is ours to understand. Let us also consider the specific archaeological discoveries that have shifted the understanding of Australian coastal prehistory in recent years. Because the pace of new findings has been accelerating and the direction of the revision is consistently toward deeper and more complex than previously thought. In 2022, a team working in the Pilbara region of Western Australia published findings from a rock shelter called Jukan Gorge, or rather from the analysis of material salvaged before that rock shelter was devastated by a mining explosion in 2020 by the mining company Rio Tinto, an act that became one of the most discussed and most condemned instances of cultural heritage destruction in recent Australian history. The destruction of Jukan Gorge was a specific and named catastrophe, but it was also an exemplar of a broader pattern. Jukan Gorge had been occupied for at least 46,000 years. It contains some of the oldest evidence of human occupation in the Pilbara region, and some of the most significant evidence for the continuity of occupation across the dramatic environmental changes of the last glacial cycle. It was gone because a mining company judged that the ore beneath it was worth more than the evidence of 46,000 years of human presence above it. The fury that the destruction of Jukan Gorge generated in Australia and internationally reflected a genuine shift in public understanding of what Aboriginal cultural heritage represents and how it should be treated. The site was not a museum, it was not a tourist attraction. It was a place where human beings had lived for 46,000 years, and where the material evidence of that long occupation had been accumulating in a protected and preserved stratigraphy that could not be reproduced or replaced. Its destruction was irreversible in a way that is hard to overstate. The aftermath of the Jukan Gorge destruction included a parliamentary inquiry, changes to the legislative framework governing the destruction of Aboriginal cultural heritage in Western Australia, and a broader public conversation about the relationship between the legal protections for Aboriginal cultural heritage and the economic interests of the mining industry. The conversation is ongoing, and the legislative changes that resulted, while significant, have been criticised by Aboriginal communities and heritage advocates as insufficient to prevent similar events in the future. The specific vulnerability of coastal and near-coastal sites in resource-rich regions of Western Australia and Queensland to mining and industrial development is not resolved. Jukan Gorge was not a coastal site in the strict sense, though it was in country that is connected to the coast of the Pilbara. But its destruction illustrates the vulnerability of Australian prehistoric sites to industrial development, and that vulnerability is as acute for coastal sites as for inland ones. The offshore petroleum industry, the LNG industry, the iron ore export infrastructure, and the emerging offshore wind energy industry all involve activities that occur in the coastal zone and that have impacts on the physical environment in ways that can damage or destroy archaeological sites that are not yet identified or assessed. The specific case of the northwestern Australian coast, where the petroleum and LNG industries have been operating for decades, is one where the intersection of industrial activity and unassessed archaeological potential is most acute. The coastal and near-coastal zone of the Kimberley and Pilbara regions, including the continental shelf within the offshore petroleum licensing areas, is among the most archaeologically significant and least archaeologically investigated areas in Australia. The industrial activity that has occurred there has not been subject to the kind of archaeological impact assessment that would be required for comparable activity in many other countries with significant prehistoric heritage, because the legal framework in Australia has not required it for offshore areas and has not adequately enforced it for coastal areas. This is changing, but it is changing slowly, and the pace of the change is not keeping up with the pace of industrial activity. The cultural heritage of the Australian coast deserves better protection than it currently receives, and that better protection requires better knowledge of what is there to be protected. Which brings the argument back to the fundamental point. The investigation of the Australian coastal archaeological record, including its submerged component, is both a scientific priority and a conservation priority, and the two cannot be separated. What is at stake in the investigation of the Australian coastal record is not simply the satisfaction of academic curiosity. It is the full historical account of what human beings have done on this coast and what they have known about it. The knowledge that was built here, over 50,000 years, represents a genuine human intellectual achievement of the first order. It deserves to be understood, to be documented, to be protected, and to be honored. The communities that created and maintained it deserve to have it recognized, not as an anthropological curiosity, but as the intellectual heritage of the people who belong to this coast and who have always belonged to it. The deeper we dig into Australia's coast, the stranger it gets. The stranger it gets, the more clearly we can see the outline of something that the standard account has never adequately captured. The full weight and depth and beauty of the oldest coastal culture on Earth. A culture that watched the sea rise and kept its knowledge of what the sea took. A culture that maintained the conversation between human beings and the ocean for longer than any other known human tradition. A culture that is still here, still speaking, still keeping the watch at the edge of the water. That is what Australia's coast holds. And the work of understanding it in full and with the respect it deserves is one of the most important tasks that the human community faces as it tries to understand itself and its past. The coast is waiting. The communities are waiting, the shelf is waiting, and the knowledge is waiting, in the traditions that survived and in the sediment on the ocean floor, for the investigation that will finally, fully read it. Make of that what you will. There is a question that hangs over all of this investigation and that nobody has yet answered in a fully satisfying way. Why did it take so long? The Australian continent was colonised by European settlers beginning in 1788, and the archaeological investigation of Australian prehistory began not long after. For more than 2 centuries, researchers have been working on the question of what happened on this continent before European contact. The evidence for sophisticated coastal occupation, for deep sea level memory and oral traditions, for aquaculture infrastructure of great antiquity and complexity, for maritime activity of significant capability, has been accumulating across that period. Why did it take until the late 20th century, and in some cases the early 21st century, for these findings to be accepted? And why does the full account of what happened on Australia's coast remain so incomplete? Part of the answer is methodological. The tools for dating ancient sites, for analyzing ancient DNA, for conducting underwater archaeological survey, for systematically cross-referencing oral traditions with geological data, are themselves relatively recent developments. The investigations that produced the most significant revisions to our understanding of Australian coastal prehistory could not have been done with the methods available a generation ago. But part of the answer is not methodological. Part of the answer is that the standard narrative of Australian prehistory was shaped by assumptions, some conscious and some unconscious, that Aboriginal Australians were simple and primitive people who had lived in essentially unchanged ways on a continent they barely affected, and that those assumptions made researchers less willing to look for and less willing to accept evidence that contradicted them. The systematic underestimation of Aboriginal cultural sophistication that characterized much of the colonial and early post-colonial research tradition was not a neutral methodological error. It reflected a set of beliefs about who Aboriginal people were that were shaped by the political and ideological context of colonialism and that served specific political purposes. Overcoming those assumptions has required not just better methods, but a fundamental change in who is doing the research, what questions they are asking, and in what relationship to Aboriginal communities the research is conducted. That change is ongoing, and the research it has made possible is producing the most significant revisions to Australian prehistory in the history of the field. The deeper we dig, the stranger it gets. And the stranger it gets, the clearer it becomes that the standard account was shaped as much by ideology as by evidence, and that the real account, the one that the evidence is now beginning to reveal, is richer, deeper, and more worthy of the people whose history it is. The coast is telling that story. It has always been telling that story. It will keep telling it for as long as the water moves, and the communities that belong to it are there to listen and to pass the knowledge on. The deeper we dig, the more of it we hear. One last thought before we leave the coast to its own patience. The communities of coastal Australia, those that have survived with their connections to country intact, and those that are in the process of reasserting and rebuilding those connections, are not simply the subjects of this investigation. They are its most important participants and its most important beneficiaries. The research into Australian coastal prehistory is most significant not in the context of academic journals and museum collections, but in the context of the living communities whose history it is and whose future is shaped partly by how that history is understood and valued. When the traditional knowledge of coastal communities is documented and recognized as scientifically valid ecological information, it strengthens the legal and political position of those communities in advocating for the management of their country. When the sophisticated pre-contact aquaculture systems of communities like the Gunditjmara are recognized and inscribed by UNESCO, it changes the terms on which those communities engage with the institutions of the wider Australian state. When the oral traditions that encode 12,000-year-old sea level memory are validated by geological analysis, it shifts the epistemological ground on which Indigenous knowledge systems are evaluated. The research has consequences that extend far beyond the academy. The deeper we dig, the more those consequences ripple outward, touching the lives of people whose ancestors kept this knowledge alive through everything that tried to end it. That is the final and most important thing that the Australian coastal story teaches us. Knowledge, kept faithfully across time, has power. The coast is strange, and it is deep, and it is old, and it belongs to the people who have always known it. The water holds what was built on it. The stone holds what was carved into it, and the people hold what was passed down to them. All of it is still here, still waiting, still speaking to anyone willing to come close enough to listen. The deeper we dig into Australia coast, the stranger and the richer it gets, and it will keep getting stranger and richer for as long as we are willing to dig. The coast endures, always has, it always will.